Welcome to the joint City Council Utility Advisory Committee Workshop, October 7th, 2020. This meeting is being conducted in accordance with the emergency directives, beginning with 006. Public comment will be provided via call-in, or I guess we had the announcement that people could email public comment prior to the meeting. I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I do want to thank all the members of the Utility Advisory Committee. You folks are volunteers, put in an awful lot of time in reviewing information, attending meetings, making recommendations. I know that we're not where we would like to be due to the pandemic, but again, I really do appreciate all the work that you've been putting in, as well as Mr. Porter, you and your staff, the consultants. We're seeing this process move forward, and I know there's some things like a report that we had hoped to get out. I want to assure the committee that as much as we would like to be able to get that information from you, we understand. Things have been very disrupted this year, so we'll do the best we can. I'm sure that we will get the process completed here in the not too distant future. We'll begin with public comment. Anyone wishing to speak during public comment, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Again, this is our initial public comment period. Comments during this period must be related to items on the agenda. The phone number again is 702-589-9629.
Public comment.
Yes, I have public comment.
Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, committee members and city council members. Fred Volz for the record, and my comments address agenda item number 1. Charging utility ratepayers a franchise fee beginning in fiscal year 22 to use their own property makes no sense. Any real estate owned by the city of Boulder City does not belong to unelected city employees who believe they can use it or tax it as they see fit. Rather, the city's real estate belongs to the people who live in Boulder City, who are also its utility ratepayers. The franchise fee effectively becomes another superfluous tax on our many limited income residents and struggling business owners. It needs to be completely stricken from rate calculations. The 36.5% increase in the central services fees between fiscal year 21 and 22 from $1,025,000 to $1.4 million has inadequate justification. Even the current $1,025,000 has been summarily presented with no detailed explanation of precisely what central services the utility department uses. The continued subsidization in water rates by residential users gives the city golf courses and artificially low rates. The courses should be treated as an enterprise fund and charged retail rates. Perhaps the largest flaw in this rate study is the lack of accurate accounting for past and current capital project budgets and spending, which sits squarely at city staff's door, not the consultants. The consultants necessarily took suspect information from city staff and plugged it into their model. Starting back in September of 2019, the issue of budgeted but unspent utility capital project money was brought to public attention with the first capital project spreadsheet extending back to fiscal year 16. Through 5 other spreadsheet iterations, the last on August 31st of this year, past projects needing reconciliation have mysteriously disappeared. The collective money actually spent or encumbered in a given fiscal year has been far lower than the budget, with no accounting for where it now sits or procedures for accurately tracking its whereabouts, rather than carelessly rolling it over from year to year. On page 14 of today's support package, we see the June 30, 2020 unrestricted utility fund balance of $30.6 million. The City Finance Department's 5/31/2020 cash by fund sheet shows $25.543 million. Table 29, page 54 of today's support materials shows a fiscal year 2020 ending utility operating fund balance of $23.391 million. Table 30 of today's support materials shows unrestricted cash of $19.011 million for the end of fiscal year 20. Page 15 of today's support package shows fiscal year 21 year-end cash flow unrestricted cash balance of $20.298 million, even though there has been a 6-month moratorium on new capital projects. Given these varying numbers, even if we go with the larger page 14 number, how will the utility department possibly spend $10.3 million on new capital projects in 6 months' time? Why is this important? The amount of unrestricted cash sloshing around in utility funds that hasn't been properly accounted for makes a huge difference in the amount of new money the utility department needs to conduct business. Without accurate and consistent numbers, we are setting rates in the dark. A capital improvement project coordinator has been on staff now at full compensation of roughly $100,000, and she has apparently been instructed to forget the past and focus only on the active projects. The city finance director tried to reconcile back to the December 31, 2019 city financial reports, which was not the core question at issue. The core question is, where are the unspent monies from past projects that have been canceled, came in under budget, or otherwise didn't spend all the money allocated to them? The instant question needing an answer from the city's finance director today: when will the external auditors at Hinton Burdick produce their findings? It took a recent request at the Audit Review Committee for the finance director to formally ask the question of Hinton Burdick 13 months after it was first asked in public, and are repeatedly ignored by the city manager, utility director, finance director, and external auditors in previous annual reviews of the city's finances. Thank you, and I would ask that these comments be added verbatim to the record.
Thank you. Anyone wishing to speak in our initial public comment period, the phone line is available. The phone number is 702-589-9629. Again, anyone wishing to speak in the initial public comment period, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Madam City Clerk, did we have any written comments submitted?
No comments were submitted.
Thank you. Again, this is the initial public comment period. The phone number is 702-589-9629. All right, hearing no others, we will close the initial public comment period. Move to the first item on the agenda. Mr. Porter.
Thank you, Mayor and Council, for, first of all, for making this happen, where we could actually get both the Utility Advisory Committee as well as the City Council together to discuss the presentation that you're going to see from Raftellus Consulting regarding the financial plan, the results of the cost of service study, and recommendations from the consultant. We have with us here today Bill Stannard with Raftellus Consulting and Colin Drapp. They will be presenting a lot of information, a lot of numbers, and then some recommendations that we can have discussion on. So with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Again, I'm Bill Stannard with Raftellus, and Mr. Mayor, members of council, and members of the Utility Advisory Committee. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you this afternoon, reviewing the results of the analysis that we were engaged by the city to do just a short 12 months ago.
It just seems much longer ago.
That is true. So, and certainly want to we've gotten to the point to be able to provide you some of our findings based on our analysis and some recommendations and issues that you really need consideration and decision by the city in order to provide information so that the work can be completed. So with that, make sure I do this correctly. Okay. So again, we'll want to spend a little bit of talk. Here's the agenda and go through the components of the study. And in some ways, it's at a fairly high level and not down in the weeds. But I certainly would welcome any questions that you have, or members of the committee, if you'd like to ask questions at the conclusion. I'll pause at the end of each slide in case there are any questions, and we can, unless you would prefer that we wait to the very end. So I'm going to leave it up to you, Mr. Mayor.
I do think your first recommendation, if you would pause at the end of each slide, that way we don't forget things when we get to the end and the information's a little fresher. Thank you.
Be happy to do that. So again, we'll go through the process and then get to the kind of the final conclusion of areas and items and issues that need to be considered and decided upon by the council. I wanted to review a little project timeline since start off saying that it was September of last year when we were engaged. This council approved our contract, and we had our initial meeting with the Utility Advisory Committee to start the process of the study. And from there, we went on to develop initial financial plans, again, for each of the utilities. So I step back a little bit, but again, remembering that we have consolidated utilities, so we have electric, water, wastewater, and solid waste in a consolidated fund approach. But then what we want to do is examine each of those utilities individually so that they would be self-sustaining in their own right and compliant with financial policies of the city and have rates so that people pay for their share of the cost of service for the service that they're being provided. While many of our customers receive all levels of service, how they use the system is different between water and electric and wastewater. So this enables us to have a more specific examination of each utility individually. But our first step was in December, we presented preliminary financial plans, and we identified a number of issues that, with the help of the advisory committee and working with Dennis and his staff and really honing in on the capital improvement needs and capital improvement programs of utilities. Then through March, we did our preliminary cost of service in early March, did a presentation to the the Utility Advisory Committee on the preliminary cost of service analysis based on the data that we'd had at that point. A week later, the COVID issues hit and the state of Nevada issued their state of emergency rulings, which really put a pause on a lot of activities that were underway. During that period, from that point on, the council was continuing to examine budget because you had to do your job and continue to develop budgets for fiscal year that started July 1 through next June of 2021. And you really had to take into account at that point, it started with a preliminary budget, but because of the COVID issues, had to make some really tough decisions relative to what the 2021 budget needed to be to recognize the financial stress that the COVID pandemic is placing on this city as well as cities throughout the region as well as throughout the country. In May 26th, you approved the 2021 budget. Then in September, we met again with the Utility Advisory Committee during this period, honing in on the capital improvement program, adjustments to the capital improvement program to reflect the costs of new projects as well as how much money was needed to complete the projects that were underway. So we have a number of projects that were had started, and we need to understand what is left to be spent. And that meeting was on September 9th, and which brings us to today's meeting. Kind of from the standpoint of what's involved in this type of rate study. Well, there's really three components to this rate study. The first is the financial plan. So we developed a financial plan individually for each of the utilities, looking out through 2026 for that time period, that forecasting period, and then really understanding what our operating maintenance expense, forecasting what future O&M expenses will be, as well as the expenditures for capital improvements for each of the utilities. Then we bring that all together in a consolidated manner as well. The second phase of the project is the cost of service analysis. And that we'll get into that in more detail in the coming minutes of the presentation. But the cost service analysis is the second phase to understand, to inform us as to what it costs the city and its utilities to provide service to various customer classes of the city, residential, commercial, and so forth. Then finally, we get to what rates are recommended to evaluate and to recover that cost of service. So in doing the work, we had to rely on data from the city, from the city's finance department as well as the utility department. And so that included the fiscal year 2018 and 2019 audited financial reports and subsidiary ledgers and documents of the finance department. We also relied, don't have it listed here, but also the preliminary unaudited financial results for fiscal 20. So the June 30, 2020 fiscal year, that is being audited now, but we use those preliminary figures to get an understanding of where things stood at that point. We also looked at the fiscal year 20 budget and the 21 budget, not only the budget that was approved, but also the preliminary budget pre-COVID. So we kind of had those two data points to deal with. We know that the approved budget really sets the stage for 2020, but then we use the preliminary budget to help inform us as to what future costs may be, and hopefully the issues of COVID will be taken care of and will be past it by the beginning of the next fiscal year in 2021. capital improvement plans, and those went through a variety of iterations with Dennis and his staff in collaboration with the advisory committee examining each of the projects and then also getting some bids, certainly the BC TAP bid finally coming in, and so we have that and wanted to reflect that as well. Then the customer billing data and usage data from each of our customers based on what we bill for our services. Then also the key agreements that we have for purchase power as well as our water supply agreement.
With regard to the power purchase agreements, can you go over what the different components of those agreements are, where the different power comes from?
I can ask Colin Dratt and can provide some more detailed information, but essentially the various components of the power, where we get the power, whether it be the Hoover Dam or other suppliers as well, and how that includes principally energy costs as well as some fixed related costs as well. But Colin, would you have some additional comments to provide with regard to the purchase power agreements?
So there's a few different sources of power. Obviously, the least expensive one is hydropower, which is a fair amount of it, but there are also market purchases that we make, and then there's a certain amount of load balancing that occurs depending on when the energy is purchased as well. But we obviously reviewed the agreements, but we're also provided projections of what the average cost per kilowatt hour would be over the next 10 years. And we worked those into our projections. So we basically took that rate, applied that to what we thought our customers' billed usage would be, plus some allowance for loss, because you lose a little bit along the way as the power gets to us. So that was that's where that information kind of interfaces with our projections for purchase power.
And I guess what I'm looking for as well, as far as the power that comes from Hoover Dam, that contract, I believe there's actually two different contracts. The length of time those have to run?
That I don't know off the top of my head. Dennis might be able to actually provide a little more detail on that.
Those contracts have recently been renegotiated. I don't have in front of me the actual year, but once they go into effect, it's like 2057. I'd have to get you the exact number, but it's out there a ways. Silver State Energy Association, which we're a member of, they do the market purchases for us, and so on top of the hydro, they go out through a risk management process, and they purchase the market power.
The Silver State Power, what's the cost difference between that and the power we purchase from Hoover Dam?
It's almost double, I believe. I'd have to get the exact numbers, but Hoover right now, I believe, is about 2.7 cents per kilowatt. It's closer to a little over 4 for the market purchases. And it just depends on what they're having to purchase at each time of the year.
And how much of the power that we use total is supplied by the Hoover Power?
It's approximately half, not exactly, but close.
And the amount of Hoover Power that might be purchased? 0 is my understanding. There is no other power available from Hoover. It's all sold.
Correct.
And it doesn't appear that would change in the foreseeable future?
No.
Okay.
No, not with those contracts going into place.
And with this, there is a new solar project set to come online sometime next year, I believe. Within that contract, the city is able to buy, we're not required to buy, but we are able to buy some of that power.
We can purchase up to 5 megawatts at $39 a megawatt. We're also looking at purchasing probably up to maybe 3 megawatts from SNWA. They're going to have a PPA with IBV Energy, who's the Black Hills South project. And that will probably be it for, those types of contracts.
Well, part of the reason I'm asking about that, I believe we can now consider hydroelectric power from Hoover to be renewable energy. I believe there was a change in that interpretation.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 258 was approved at the last legislative session. That included hydro as a renewable energy, so we effectively already meet our obligation to the state.
And again, what I'm getting at is that there's a ballot question on the November ballot that would require all utilities to have at least 50% of their power from renewable resources by, I believe it's 2030.
That's correct.
So where Hoover is approximately half right now, if we do exercise the purchase from these other solar projects.
Yeah, we'll be, and it's actually up to a certain amount of power purchased, which we're not even close to. So it doesn't, even though it's 2030, it wouldn't impact us until even way further out in the future, because we're not close to that amount of usage.
All right, thank you. Any other questions?
So maybe just to start the next step of the presentation, really, kind of hone in on some of our key findings and recommendations. Okay.
I think the last question was addressed to power purchase agreements, and I believe underneath that is water supply agreement, and I'm not sure if you finished that discussion.
Well, that's really the SNWA with whom we purchase power, purchase water from. So really, what they charge for water and how that's reflected in our projected costs for water. I'm sorry.
And the $12, what is it, 41 cent fee that we pay, that each customer pays to SNWA.
That's part of the cost.
Part of the cost. Okay, thank you.
Yep. So first of all, and I think somewhat important to the council, is that based on our analysis of the financial condition and position of the utility, we're in sound financial position. It's a little different than some utilities around the country where they don't have adequate reserves and aren't prepared for some of the unknowns going forward. But based on our review of the documents and information, that we come to the conclusion that you're in sound financial condition. Not only that, but your revenues under existing rate levels are sufficient to meet the projected expenditures through the period 2026. So your revenues that you're currently generating will be adequate to meet future projected increases in cost, as well as the capital improvements, in tandem with the fund balances that you have, so that additional revenues will not be required and necessary. And as such, we believe that you can reduce the electric energy rate by 3%. And we can reduce the water monthly charge, the fixed charge that we assess to our customers, by $10 per month. We can incorporate that and still meet the financial obligations of the utility and have appropriate fund balances at the end of the period. Plus, we believe that we have the opportunity to accelerate principal payments on our recently refunded last year, but the refunding of our the bond issue that was made for the raw water line. So we can begin two components of advance payment of those outstanding principal payments. First is we have an existing bond reserve account that was generated through the prior bond issue that we have on our books that we'll be able to, in 2022, use that to purchase bonds from the refunding bond. And then we believe we can add another $600,000 a year in advance payments to pay off those bonds in an earlier period. So what that will do was it'll shorten the time period that the bonds will be outstanding by about 3 to 4 years. So it reduces our interest costs, and then we get rid of those bonds at the far end of the period.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
I'm sure you will go into this a little bit more, but everything I was hearing coming up to this is once you get this rate study, and we were likely going to see the opposite. We're going to see the need to increase rates. We're going to see the need to do all these sorts of things. At least that was what was constantly told to me. Obviously, if we weren't social distancing, I'd ask people to pinch me. This is great. My question is once we get to fiscal year 2026, what does that look like? Are we still, by implying, I know we can't look too far into the future, but does that leave us still in the same sound financial state that we are right now?
Yes, and based on the forecast, we would have adequate fund balances to meet the required reserve funds that the council has established in your policies. But then at that point, and probably before then, you'll want to update that forecast. But a lot of the backbone infrastructure in the current capital improvement program will be completed. So I don't expect, certainly in discussions with Dennis didn't expect that we'd have some major projects out in those future years either. So I think at that point, assuming inflation stays at a reasonable pace, that the cost will continue to climb, but at that point we may need modest increases in rates, but not probably anything greater than inflationary increases.
Thank you.
And with the contracts that we have, again, we spoke earlier about the power contracts being long-term. Those also, the rates that we pay are fairly stable, is that correct?
Yes.
So we're not expecting, we have some certainty of what we're going to be paying in 5 years.
Yeah, on the energy side, yes, and they provide forecasts, and they appear to be very stable. And while there may be moderate increases in other purchase power that we have on market-based, but that a lot of times that market-based conditions can have a bigger impact than it's difficult to project what those would be. And then our water purchase from SNWA, certainly they've laid out what they hope to be their future levels of increases in the going out, and I believe it's in the 5 to 6% a year range.
All right, and obviously the other two, the landfill and wastewater, we're not actually purchasing a product, we're getting rid of things.
Right, and on the wastewater, it's our costs of operating, maintaining, and there's capital improvement needs that are ongoing and will continue, but that is not significant changes in the wastewater cost of service or financial needs. And then solid waste, of course, we have the provider, the contract that we have that covers the cost of that service that's provided for disposal of the collection and disposal of the solid waste.
And I believe the projection right now is another 90 plus years for the landfill at current usage.
I'm not sure, but that
Mr. Porter's saying yes.
Yeah, just prior to me getting here, the city went through a process of expanding the landfill, and it is an expected probably 90 plus years based on current usage. And only during COVID have we seen that usage increase because everybody's taken the time to clean out their houses. And so we did see where we were backing up going into the landfill, there were so many people getting rid of stuff. So
and all those boxes from Amazon were piling up.
And the other thing we're doing, because we're able to do it because of the expansion, is we're able to revise that phasing plan, which we've just started that process. That phasing plan will keep the landfill from going higher than it is today because it's just windy up there and it's really hard to maintain and manage, especially with plastic grocery bags. So We're going to leave it at that maximum height and manage it so it still has the same amount of time, but we don't have to go higher.
All right. And the one other item on here is the bond payment, and this is on the raw water line. As I recall, the principal still owed on that at this time, or the total still owed on that is somewhere around 22 or 23 million.
That sounds right. I don't have the details in front of me, but yes.
Okay, so we're still looking at a fairly long horizon on being able to pay that off, even if the payments are accelerated.
Yes, and Colin, maybe it's in the tech memo, so maybe I can we'll take a look and get that back to you. But it's it takes about 3 years off of the payment period. As I recall, trying to look at the schedule, it's goes out to about 2036, and so it reduces to maybe 2033.
Okay.
So it's it's before the landfill will be filled.
Yeah.
So I guess I don't know if we schedule have a party when that happens in 90 years. We can get together and.
Well, we'll plan it now. Mr. Carl, you had a comment?
Quick comment. Sorry to dispute, but
please.
in your own documents from last time, the current repayment of the raw is through 32. If we do the advanced or oscillated, it's actually 29. Okay. So it's better. I just want to make sure it's actually better.
Yeah, I didn't have that in front of me, but I was trying to recall, trying to picture it in my mind. But thank you for correcting that. So,
Dr. Reed?
I had a comment on the hydro because it's not clear to me how stable those rates are. My understanding is we have to pay them whether or not they deliver electricity. And so, the river flows into the Colorado as 60% of what they were in the 20th century this last water year. They're lowering Powell at about a foot a day. Something's going to give at some point. We have to keep paying them whether they deliver electricity or not. What the Colorado River Commission people told me is they're just going to do an end run around BOR and go to the federal government and saying, we're not going to honor these contracts. So there are tensions underneath there that are sort of, let's say, building that sort of belie this comment, oh, don't worry, the water power costs are stable. I don't think they're as stable as they look.
Thank you.
well, I guess I haven't heard that the Bureau, people have said that they're going to go against the contracts because they are valid contracts, and I suppose people can do a breach of contract at any time, but it usually causes a lot of legal issues at that point. So if they say that they will, because under the contract they have to provide power. So if they choose not to provide power, not only will that impact Boulder City, it'll impact everyone in this region and beyond. So I think we need more clarity on that. I'm not sure who, and maybe you have a document that someone provided that to you that says that they will not comply with the contracts.
I don't have a document, but Dennis was there. We were at the coffee shop with Gail, I forgot her name, from the Colorado River Commission. She said, I can't say this in public. It always makes me want to laugh when they say that to me, a member of the public. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's a public statement. They didn't write it down, but there are tensions under there that I think, I agree with you, it's not in writing, but Dennis was there when she said it, so.
Well, I think we all need to be cognizant that, there's less water in the Colorado. And if they say, we're in a drought period and that may change, it may change. But the fact is there's less water in the Colorado, and it's water that generates the electricity. So they can't generate electricity if there's not enough water. It's a fairly simple concept.
And then I believe under the contracts, they'll have to obtain power to deliver if they can't produce it themselves. But it would really present a significant, probably national issue that would probably be a major item on the congressional agenda at that point. So hopefully that there'll be some mitigation issues or other things. We'll see some changes, but that it's not going to, hopefully will not happen in the next 6 years.
All right.
So,
Councilmember Hoskins?
Yes, for your entire presentation, I think this slide will be the most accepted with the citizens due to the reduction of 3% and the $10 fixed charge. I was led to believe for quite some time that we were going to be having much higher rates. Fortunately, we were able to stop those, and so I do appreciate this report. And like I say, I think this will probably be the most important slide of the whole presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, and don't get too excited because there's some bad news coming.
Okay, so I wanted to just cover a few things on the process for the financial planning, what we did. One, we recognize that there's moderate account growth in the system. It's not like we are aggressively trying to expand the city, but it's under managed growth, and it's really a moderate amount of growth that we've incorporated into our forecast through the 2026 period. We're also recognizing that customers will be continuing to conserve their use of water and energy, certainly through more intentional conservation as well as acquiring replacements of appliances, air conditioners, other facilities and utility elements that are more highly efficient and use less electricity and less water. So we think that will continue, and we're looking at about a 0.5% per year reduction in customer usage during this period. And looking and forecasting the operation and maintenance expense, we start with, in our planning period, with the 2021 approved budget. But then we use the 2021 preliminary budget to really set the stage for forecasting 2022 through 2026. Recognizing that in the approved budget, you had to make some decisions and reductions to reflect the financial situation associated with the pandemic. And so we felt that the 2021 budget might be a better baseline to start from in projecting what 2022 might be. Now, it's possible as you get toward 2022 that the budget that you end up approving will be maybe less than what we're projecting for 2022. But at that point, what we have is set a baseline in our forecast. And then other things that we incorporated is, of course, the purchase power and water costs, professional services, and looking at outside the outer years, working with Dennis, some next level of work that would be necessary for the condition assessment, updating condition assessment work that has recently been completed, but out in the outer year, and then as well as other professional services that might be needed in 2025 or 2026 outside of the normal budgeting standpoint, but we put placeholders in there in the financial plan. And then, of course, also recognize increased and continued inflationary impacts. Certainly one of the big unknowns is what will inflation be in the future. But we're incorporating both in terms of salaries and wages, certainly your current process that has stepped increases for younger staff, newer staff has stepped increases, plus cost of living adjustments. And looking at those your average experience in those increases reflected that in our forecast. Then looking at the capital improvement program and looking at how we finance it. So we started off with the fiscal year 21 approved CIP. Again, a lot of that work and refinements on that CIP were done in collaboration between Dennis and his staff and the Utility Advisory Council as they really took a hard look at all the projects that we have. As I indicated earlier, we had previously budgeted projects that either haven't started or have started, and we need to know how much was left to be spent on those projects. So that is, so that becomes an obligation, wanting to know how much has been budgeted to be spent, because the approval of the budget does not create any money. It's an authorization to spend. So what we looked at was, well, how much left money do we need to spend during this period on all these ongoing projects? Then what will be the scheduling and phasing of all new projects to determine what capital needs we have? And then we had to look at what are our funding sources? And then that included our fund balances. So what we have to rely on is what's included in our fund balances. How much do we have available? Because if money was raised through rates but not spent, remains in the fund balance. And then we have some external funding sources, and then of course the pay-go, which is, since we're not issuing debt and don't intend to issue debt in the future, we'll be paying for things out of current operating revenues, pay-go, or using money from our fund balances. We'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. But then we take a look at forecasting the cash flow requirements of what the utilities will need out over the 6-year period, and then are the revenues sufficient to meet what we're forecasting our expenditures to be. We'll get into a little more detail on some of the issues that the council will need to evaluate and decide what to do relative to some of these components. I don't know if there's any questions on. Okay. I want to take a look again at June 30, 2020. So working with Diane and her staff, really what the preliminary unaudited fund balances are. So we got the trial balances. We looked at all the numbers that are reported in the trial balance, subject to audit. But then here's where we are. Here's what our bank account says we have at the end of June 30th. So you can see there are 6 what we call restricted funds, and those first 6 funds are restricted, and they're restricted to be used for the categories of expenditures that are identified in the description. I do want to point out that we have an error in how we describe the RDA reserve. That's really redevelopment areas, not rural development areas, so I apologize for that, but that's the redevelopment areas. Then we have funding that's available for that. So at the end of June 30th, 2020, what we're seeing is that the fund balance of those restricted funds is $13.9 million. And then if we look at the grand total of all the other funds, all funds, it's 44.4, which leaves the unrestricted fund balance is 30.6 million. So that's based on the best available information from the city's financial records before they are audited, and any audit adjustments might happen. But I'm not sure what the history has been with regard to audit adjustments on the financial statements, preliminary financial statements in the past, but so we're relying on that, and it could change based on whatever the audit ends up with.
The second to the last line there, we have the unrestricted fund balance, strive to maintain 20% of O&M, operation and maintenance. Where are we at then? Where is that 30 million in comparison to the desired 20% of O&M?
If you can hold that, we can get that on the next page.
Okay. One more question then before we move on. The other reserve fund balances, those are fully funded at these levels now? Well, is it considered to be fully funded at these levels?
Yes, I mean, there are some things that the last two, the landfill closure and the landfill construction, those are annual payments. We'll have to continue to go into those. But so as far as fully funded, the landfill closure element is an annual requirement, and it'll just continue to build up over time to cover the cost of the landfill closure in 90 years.
And really the RDA reserve, I understand you including it here, but there is nothing in the RDA that says a portion of that money is reserved for utilities.
And I will accept that. I did not read that to see what it actually said, but it's being shown, and the finance area is showing it as a utility-related RDA that would be available for RDA-type utility projects, but it could be used, I say, that it could be used for something else. So it's really restricted for RDA kinds of activities, which may or may not include utilities.
Right. Okay, and so these others then, the emergency capital reserve, the rate stabilization reserve, and the bond reserve, those are considered to be fully funded then?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
And I guess the one thing on the RDA reserve, I guess we've identified that as restricted for utility projects. And if it's not, and as a result, it gets, so if that was funds that are available for, right now they're included in the 44.4, so the finance department is included in the total 44.4. So if that was removed from the 44.4 total, it would not change the unrestricted balance.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Bridges?
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand that correctly, because I had downloaded from our code for the 1.9.7 RDA utility project reserve account. Any expenditure from this account must be used for the purposes described in this section and approved by formal action of the city council. So does that mean that I'm assuming that means that it has to be used for utility? Unless I'm asking a question. I'm not stating anything. I want to make sure that I understand that that's what that means.
Yeah, I would have to rely on finance to really clarify that, but I know that they're including the 900,000 on the utility side as the fund balance is available for utilities. If it's restricted, and I have to go back and take a look at that language, but and if it says that it's restricted for utility use, then it would have to be restricted for utility use. Mm-hmm. And so it'd be for a project, but in order to spend it, it has to go through council, and the council has to say, yes, we want to use this money. This project complies with this resolution, and we can use these funds for this project.
Okay.
And the other way about going about that is you pass another resolution that says, no, it's different now. That's my understanding of it.
The council probably has quite a bit of flexibility.
I believe so, yes.
As opposed to things like the bond reserve account, which is really restricted by federal tax laws associated with how you can use those bond reserve monies. And now, since we refunded those bonds, that money is available, but with wide discretion. But the direction we were given is that we want to use that to pay off some of those bonds as quickly as we can.
Right, and what I'm getting at is there's no statutory requirement regarding that RDA fund. It's by resolution.
Right.
Resolutions can change.
Okay. Any other questions?
Mr. Carl?
Well, just the one, since we're on the reserves, just to help clarify, and especially relating to the energy possible problems, is that we do have the $3 million in rate stabilization. And if I'm reading it correctly, it actually states that it can be used for both water and power. So I guess if we had a really bad year, theoretically, we could use the full $3 million for power. Not saying that's the best thing, but at least we have some now that would help compensate for that. So that reserve, in that aspect, helps that quite a bit.
Thank you.
Okay, so to what this slide shows is the projected cash flow for the combined utilities. And get to your question, Mr. Mayor, with regard to the unrestricted fund balances and the percent of O&M that we are, which is at the very bottom. But starting off with, first of all, in the total revenue that we're projecting, this is what we've done is we took liberty to forecast reflecting that 3% reduction in energy rates and $10 a month reduction in the water charge. We've reflected that in this forecast so we can see, well, if we do that, can we still meet our obligations? So then after that, we have the revenue requirements for the utilities. And so the revenue requirements include operation and maintenance expense. And among that, we have the first three are things that are provided by external service providers. That's the purchase power, purchase water, and then our solid waste services, which is contracted service, that we have those components. And that is about, so just looking at 2021, about just shy of $11 million. So about 35% of our total revenue needs to go to those purchased requirements of that, so that about $11.5 million. Then the next component of items are things that we do internally. Those are the utility directly related costs. So we have maintenance and equipment, we have personnel costs, we have technical and professional services, we have supplies, and then other. And those components, again, for 2021 reflect what's in the approved 2021 budget. But then beginning in 2022, we took the preliminary 2021 budget, not the approved budget, the preliminary budget, and then inflated those to get to 2022 cost levels. Then we get to the next two items that are items for discussion. So one is the central service fee, which currently is $1,025,000. And then the next item below that is franchise fee. So what's usually included in a central service fee, kind of think of it as overhead costs associated with activities of the city that support, not directly but indirectly, utility operations, whether that be the finance department, be city council's costs associated with city council, city manager's office, city attorney's office, things like that that are overhead in nature and need to be allocated. Many cities, a couple of approaches to this. One is to do what's called an indirect cost study. And so engage a consultant to actually take a hard look at the indirect costs and how do we distribute the costs of the general fund activities among enterprise funds as well as other general funds that may be getting support services. In this case, the finance department had done provided an estimate that they had done that showed about $1.4 million based on full-time equivalents and using some general approaches for determining indirect cost levels. We were asked to say, well, if we went to 1.4 million, is that out of bounds with what you see in other systems around the country? And as we looked at that, the percentage of costs related to total revenue requirement, it wasn't an unreasonable number. But it was based on the data that had been provided by Finance Department with regard to their analysis of what those indirect costs would be. So why is that important? Well, there's an ancillary element that relates to the cost of service study, where we determined that the cost of service for electric and water service provided to city accounts under statute, under resolution, is restricted to the wholesale cost of the water that we purchase from SNWA or the average cost of energy, and there's no reflection of the infrastructure costs and the delivery costs of those services to those city accounts. So if we were to, and as we'll get into this in a little more detail, we'll say that if we were to charge city accounts the full cost of service, principally on water, but also on electric, there would be substantial increase in cost to the general fund to cover those costs, because those accounts are not enterprise funds at this point. They're all general fund accounts. So there would be a big increase in cost. And so then how do we offset that big increase in cost? Well, there are options. And so the other element was a franchise fee. So the question that was posed to us was, is it common for cities to charge a franchise fee to their municipally owned utilities? And I'd say it's It's not uncommon, it's fairly common to do that. And in fact, even in this region, I know Henderson charges a franchise fee. So, well, what is that franchise fee? Is it a cost recovery? No, it really isn't a cost recovery. Even when we charge it to an investor-owned utility, it's not to recover any of our costs. It's a fee associated with the franchise that they've been awarded. So they've been awarded a franchise, a territory area to serve, and in return for that, and the quid pro quo, a part of that is they pay a franchise fee. And so it's not uncommon for a municipally owned utility to be assessed a franchise fee by the general fund. But it's not a requirement, and in fact, we were asked if it's statutorily authorized in Nevada. We didn't do that analysis, but the city's finance advisor did an analysis and determined that both their statutory authorization as well as in the administrative code allows cities to charge a regional franchise fee. So the issue then before you will end up being, do we want to increase the cost for the charge for central services to reflect that? And is that 1.4 million a reasonable estimate of what that, or do we stick with the $1,025,000? And would it be appropriate to include a franchise fee? And I guarantee, the franchise fee would be an increased cost to the utility. But we don't have to increase rates to recover it. So if you think about where we are, if we exclude the 1.4 million for all those outlying years, our fund balance would be higher. And then other decisions can be made, or you could have more reserves for unknown situations into the future. So that's our total O&M cost that we have on that line, ranging from 19.4 million, then increasing over time to 26.5 million at the end of 2026. Again, it's projections, it's forecasts. The city, you, the council, will be examining the budget every year, and this will need to be reevaluated, and staff can do that reevaluation. But if for whatever reason inflation goes to 12% a year, then these costs might climb higher, and adjustments would have to be made into the financial plan. If costs end up being lower, or there's other things that we can reduce costs, then the forecast could be reduced at that time. Then we have capital costs. That includes debt service. Again, that's debt service on the outstanding bonds. Then we have the accelerated repayment beginning in 2022 of $600,000 per year. That's included in there as something that will come out of our total funds each year. Then we have pay-go capital that ranges from 18.7 million, then down to 3.4, and then it kind of goes up and then down. And one of the challenges of doing things on a pay-go basis is that it's driven by how much capital improvements you need. So if all of a sudden you need to spend a bunch of money on capital improvements, those costs can go up quite a bit. But then once you've spent those, they go down. And fortunately, we have fund balances that we're able to use. That becomes our balancing account, so that we're using money in our fund balances to pay for these pay-go capital requirements without having to have rates go up and down every year to meet those obligations. So when you think about cities, whether it be Henderson or other cities, they will try to leverage their revenues because they don't have adequate fund balances, or they don't want to use those fund balances in that way, that they will issue debt so that they can stabilize the annual repayment with debt over time. But we're able to do that essentially with our fund balances. So the good news is we have strong unrestricted fund balances at the beginning of this period, and we can use that money soundly through this period without needing to increase revenues from our customers. So then you can see that we have the total revenue requirements, and then what the ending unrestricted fund balance would be. So starting with 20.3 $20,298,000, and that's 104% of O&M, so well above the 20% requirement, not requirement, but target that the council has set forth for the unrestricted fund balances. But over time, that will drop because we're using it for these major capital improvements that we're working on right now. And so it'll go down to 39%. Plus then, and that also reflects the 1.4 million for central service fee and the 1.4 million comparable number for the franchise fee. So again, if those numbers disappear, that would be about 1.6 million or 1.8 million a year more that would be staying within the fund balance. I don't know. Hopefully that made some sense with the it's kind of, because there's multiple things we have going on at this point. So we have a number of balls in the air that we're trying to balance at this point. But, yeah, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Hoskins?
Yes, I'm concerned with this franchise fee. You know, we can always do a lot of things, but should we do them? And we're not Cox Cable. So I really, if we're going to give a reduction and then we're going to have a franchise fee, what are we accomplishing? So the last slide was the best. This is probably the worst.
Well, I think it'll get worse. It may get worse.
Thank you so much.
So I understand that question. So,
Mr. Carl?
Can so I've got, from the previous slides, I was hoping I could hold my questions to this one. So I've got several things that I think would help the council as far as, I guess I'm still a little concerned that I don't see that anything's been addressed that we've asked in the past. And I know it's only been 3 weeks, but it's still confusing. So if we start off at this slide and we go to the revenues, I did not see that there was any explanation of if the water revenue has been checked. So when you have 11.5 or 11 some odd in the revenue and the city is estimating 9.7, what are we working on? I'll just go through my questions right quick.
Well, it may be easier for me to answer that.
Okay.
Yes, we did check it. We checked it with the city. Our numbers were confirmed. So I don't know what you're looking at, but the city finance department.
That was the actual for fiscal.
That was the actual. That's the actual. So if the actuals are the actual, so that's what we're relying on.
Okay. The sheet that you include is your reduced amount, and that's 9.7. So I guess I'd still so a lot of the stuff I would just think we need to review before we go through the final report or have it reviewed. It'd be very helpful. So when you're looking at the blue section, the maintenance and through the other, those have increased from just our last meeting, just the September meeting. We were asking for explanations of why they were high, and they went increased more. You've got 26% from 22 to from 21 in finance, in maintenance. You have 16% in personnel, and you have a 7% going out where it was only 2% in the future. So these are things that we need the finance review because these are data you have. So hopefully we can look at them and go forward before we finalize, again, the draft report. And then the other, okay, I'm sorry.
Let Colin answer that because I don't think they changed. So.
Right. I mean, I'd have to look at I'd look at the maintenance and equipment number so that shouldn't have changed. Personnel costs we took another look at. And what we had in there was actually a little bit too low in terms of the annual increases, given that there are inflationary increases each year and then step increases. The other stuff I don't think should have changed from the last presentation, but again, I'll take a look at it. I mean, I think the bottom line with all of these is, worst case scenario, this stuff doesn't happen. Everything just looks a little bit better. So what we're trying to do is be sufficiently conservative. We're not asking for any additional rate revenue with these projections. We're just saying, as best we know, based on our conversations with staff, looking at the information we have, here's what we think is going to happen. And even with that built in, we're still in pretty good shape. So are there details to be worked out, numbers to be confirmed? And maybe there are, and I think that that's something that we can continue to work through. But to the extent that something is a little too high, I mean, it's just, to some extent, that's just a little, maybe, it's a little bit of conservatism that's built into what you're seeing. And we're still able to do what we're able to do with the recommendations. So I don't know if now is the best time to check the numbers or if we need to work together in the interim just to confirm some of these.
Well, we're not going to stop now to check the numbers, but,
Yeah.
they need to be verified.
Right.
Mr. Carl, did you have other questions? Or?
Yeah, maybe I misunderstood. I was looking at the percentage between the 22 and the 21 and the 22. Since we have reduced it because of COVID, then there were some assumptions that went into 22, and I just was trying to confirm that. So I don't believe the maintenance did go up.
Shouldn't have changed from our last
No, not from the last,
presentation.
but the personnel did.
Yes. No,
And so the other thing too is to understand in the blue section is this is one thing we've asked for also from the committee is that a better understanding of the admin fund. So you have $2 million, if I understand correctly, somewhere in this blue section that is on top of the 1.4 and the centralized fees and the franchise fee. So it's a matter of trying to understand because you're going to end up with 4.8 going into the admin fund in the future.
No, the admin fund is Dennis and his operations. We've given you the detail on all the components of the admin fund. We'll give it to you again. You'll see all the components that are within the utility budget. That's not, the central services is something else. It's not admin costs. It's utility admin. Those costs are Dennis's and his operation, and there's equipment included in that. There's whatever is in the budget category. Be happy to resend that to you again, and maybe we can have another call and we can go over it in detail with you. But those numbers are, there's not a doubling up of admin. So admin is within utility, there's an admin fund that covers the cost of the utility director and utility director's staff.
This was more of a comment, as Norm MacDonald would say, but we're talking about an increase in the rates. Let's be crystal clear. So it's sort of a bit of a hall of mirrors. Well, we're projecting, decreases. No. The recommendations of the study are that we increase the rates indefinitely into the future, but certainly to 2026. I hope the council is clear that that's what's being proposed here. It's not a decrease. FY21, we're through it. I mean, when are we going to decrease by 3%? And then the next year we increase, and the year after that, and the year after that. So let's be clear on what's being proposed, unless I've misunderstood.
You did misunderstand. We have not proposed any increases at this point. We're proposing.
I'm sorry, sir. What does it say here? 5-year phase-in of energy.
Well, wait.
Yeah, George,
Do you want?
we'll get to that from
You can.
Okay, let me make my comment
the
then.
next slide.
Rate recommendations, 5-year phase-in of energy rates to achieve cost of service by class in FY 2026. That presumably means an increase, not a decrease of energy rates. That's all I have to say.
Well, I'll make 2 more comments and then I'll continue. Let you. So the biggest thing I guess I'm looking at is that the admin fund has been very confusing. So we've got a certain amount that is transferred out, and they broke that out in the slides that they added on at the end of the presentation. And it was helpful. There's 3 separate transfers of fund to the admin fund, but it's still, and so we were given a breakdown of the admin fund, but it's not been included in the slides. So it's still confusing to exactly what it is. And when the central fund goes back to the general fund, then trying to understand what that is paid for. So, when you're looking at $2 million, it seems a lot if we're talking about when you transfer out, it looks like a lot of money going to just the overhead for these utilities. The other one I want to look at is understand is that the end of the ending unrestricted fund balance or the beginning unrestricted fund balance, however you will look at it, I believe that includes the 20% that exists already or has been collected, the operating reserves for all the utilities. And that could be problematic because if you get down to and you get close to it, any of these funds, then it's about $4 million, I think. And we really want to be able to reserve that, not have to get into it. So that's more, I think, more of an emergency type aspect, not something we can just say we can get into. It's just something to be thinking. So I think the unrestricted fund, as it's in the manager's report, would be better to separate out all the reserves as 17 million, and then the available funds as what is cash for it currently available for all the funds. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of comments that I have on it with this franchise fee and how much the city charges itself. There may be some inequities there, and I'm not even sure that that's the right word because I don't know that it's really an unequal situation. I think we need to keep in mind when we look at any of these things, if we charge a franchise fee, and I know we do, to Cox Cable or CenturyLink, those are for-profit companies that are using our city resources to run their businesses. In this case, we're talking about ourselves. So whether that's the residents, the ratepayers, whatever you want to call an individual person, they're a Boulder City resident. So to be able to say or to say that, well, we're going to charge that person some more money and we're going to take that money and we're going to put it over here, and then we're going to charge over here some money and put it back over here. To me, it seems that we give ourselves, and when I say ourselves, I mean all the residents in Boulder City, a break when we say we're going to pay only the wholesale rate for power and water to run the city, to water our parks, to light our street lights, to do those types of things. So it's not that anyone's losing on that deal. We're just saying we're going to charge ourselves the wholesale rate. And we're not going to charge ourselves for using our streets, our alleys, our phone poles, those types of things. We're also going to save money for the residents by saying we all own that together. It benefits all of us together. Right. And so we're just not going to charge ourselves. And to say now, after 60 years, well, we're going to start charging ourselves for that, but then we'll charge ourselves even more over here, and magically that's all going to balance out. Or we could just say, it's been working for 60 years. We could just leave it all alone and essentially give ourselves a break on either side of it. So right. I don't agree with the logic of imposing fees on our ratepayers and then saying the city, which is those same ratepayers, will somehow pay that money back. If it's a wash, then it's a wash at the rate we're at right now. So I don't see us doing that.
And those are great points, and those are, like I say, just experience from other cities that assess charges to utilities, because sometimes the governing bodies of a city are balancing, in a lot of cases, property tax revenues, and is it a way to reduce property tax revenues or manage their property tax revenues and get additional funding, but it comes through the utility ratepayer. So for Cox and other investor-owned, what they'll do when the enterprise, usually, and I suspect they do here as well, the franchise fee is actually a line item on a customer's bill. So it shows what the franchise fee is. It's not rolled into the revenue requirement. But they say, why cities, governing bodies have made those decisions, it's really unique to every city, and they have to deliberate and evaluate what's best for our community and what we're trying to accomplish. So we're not proposing that you increase or implement a franchise fee, but we've been asked to layer that in there for you to consider. And likewise on the central services fee, could that be increased? It could be, but again, it's something for you to consider. We're not recommending that it be increased.
And I appreciate that, you know, this is clearly a policy decision as to whether we do something like that. I just don't see that it's necessary. You know, all I see is it's an opportunity for future councils to say, well, you know, that 3%, 5%, that's not enough. We're going to bump that up a few more percent. And people just wind up paying more. You know, it's like when you go to your bank and they charge you, you know, a fee to come in the door. I'm not getting any value out of coming in the door, so I don't see that as being necessary. The other thing on the percent of O&M, the bottom line on that, as we go across, we're then apparently at 104% of what we need.
No, that's the fund balance divided by O&M. So that fund balance of 20 million is 104% of the 19.5 million. So the target that the city council has adopted is try to have a minimum of 20%, try to maintain at least 20%, not maintain just 20%, but try to strive for at least 20%. So it's not even a requirement because it's almost like working capital in some ways. But if it's working capital, but you set a limit of our working capital balance can never go below this, then it loses its value as a working capital. It becomes a requirement then. So it's kind of up to you. If we right now what we're saying is that at the end of this forecast period we'd be at 39%. And the minimum that you want to strive for is 20%. So we're about double what the council has decreed as what we should strive to achieve as a minimum. Hopefully that explains your question.
And as we look out then 2026, we're still at 39%?
Yes.
And the target it stays at 20%?
Yes.
So again, what I see here is we're well in excess of what the recommendation is, what our target is.
You're in excess of that, so yes.
And we now have these other reserves that have been built up, the rate stabilization, the emergency capital. I don't believe the emergency capital fund existed before. I think that was something we did in the recent budget.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm getting at is we've done well in order to be able to put money away, to be able to plan for the future, but we're still keeping the same target of this 20%. I know in our general fund, we recently, because the state changed the law, we recently lowered that down. I think the state law requirement now is 16.7% or something like that. So we were able to reduce that reserve slightly, but at the same time, we had created all these other reserve funds and funded those.
Yes.
So we still apparently have sufficient money sitting in reserves.
Yes.
Okay.
And we project that you will continue to have sufficient money in reserves, even if we spent this level as forecasted.
Right. Okay. Councilmember Bridges?
Thank you. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Franchise fee, first of all. Is it common amongst municipal utilities to have a franchise fee? As opposed to, you know, if we had Nevada Energy or, I mean, I know we have SNWA Water, but in terms of our electricity.
It's not uncommon. Common is how common is it? It's there are cities that charge their utility either a much bigger transfer or state it in terms of a franchise fee. Henderson, for example, has a franchise fee that they charge their municipal utility.
Do they have a municipal utility? I don't.
Yes, yeah, it's water and wastewater.
They're water.
Just water and wastewater.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they probably charge a franchise fee to their electric provider as well, but.
Right, which is Nevada Energy or
right.
Southwest Gas. But it's basically we're charging ourselves and moving funds from the enterprise fund into the general fund.
Yeah. So the only kind of the one balancing thing on that concept is that citizens who pay taxes, property taxes, will they, to the extent that, is their percentage of the property tax equal to what they spend in their utility bill? Is it a zero-sum game for each individual customer? Probably not. But for in total, what it means is we'd be asking our utility customers to pay for, out of their utility funds, a franchise fee, say 1.4 million, that would go to the general fund. So it increases the ability of the general fund to provide services to those same citizens. But rather than charging it in terms of a tax, it's recovered in ways of a franchise fee instead. So if you wanted to increase your funding or spending by 1.4 million, and the only way you could do it was through increasing taxes, you'd have to make that decision. Or we can do it through a franchise fee. We won't have to increase taxes, and we'll let the utility director worry about supporting a rate increase.
Yay, Dennis.
But that's kind of the, it's really what you have to deal with every year is really what are your priorities? How do you establish those priorities when you do your budgeting? Because we don't have unlimited resources. So how do we do that priority-based budgeting and then make sure we are meeting the levels of service that our citizens desire and demand, citizens and businesses that support the city?
Okay. I know I understand what it is, and it sounds like a non-tax tax. And for those who pay low property taxes in our community, it adds a tax, so to speak, to them. And those who pay higher property taxes, it adds additional tax to them without calling it a tax. So, and it's for the purpose of raising funds for the general fund.
That's the purpose of the process.
Okay. And secondly, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the 18.75 million PAYGO capital. Is that based on current budgeted CIP?
It's what's left to spend on ongoing projects that were previously budgeted that we haven't spent the full amount yet, plus what's in the approved CIP. And it also, I think, probably reflects the current bid on the BC TAP.
So it's not cash sitting in an account. It's budget. It's budget. It is cash sitting in an account, or
it will be spent out of cash you have in hand.
On hand. Okay. And there was. So it's just going forward that the budgets will be lower. So any emergency down the road comes from that, all those reserves.
Yes. So whether emergency reserve funds or your operating reserve fund is to provide funding for unexpected, unknown occurrences that may require us to spend money.
Okay, and one other question, please. This is fiscal year 2021. Have previous years' PAYGO capital been this high? Is this a highest? Is this an average? Where is this compared to our historical PAYGO?
We didn't look at the historical, what was actually spent in those years, but we may have looked at 2020. So, Dennis.
They're a little higher, primarily because of two projects. One that was just completed, the 69 kV loop, and then we have the BC TAP to Buchanan, which is almost 10 million. So those two projects account for some of the increases because they had to be done.
Okay.
And then in the future, there's some, it kind of falls once we get the big projects done, and it levels off a little bit, but there still are small spikes. What we did try to do was, both on the water and sewer and the electric, is make them as, I don't know what the right word is, but we tried to level those out somewhat so there would be less impact. We fortunately had the fund balance available to be able to do these bigger projects. They're not as big going into the future, so that levels out somewhat. It still has spikes between years depending on if there's substation rebuilds or some bigger projects, but it's certainly going to be less in the future.
Okay, thank you. That's it for right. Oh, I did. I'm sorry. One more quick question. Is that 20% rule of thumb typical for a PAYGO city? As opposed to one who takes out debt?
Some cities have much higher fund balances, but they also use debt. And so in order to get higher credit ratings from the rating agencies, they want to maintain higher liquidity.
Okay.
So it's the best way to look at it is from a risk management standpoint. What are our risks and how can we mitigate risk through having money in the bank? So it's it could be a rainy day fund, but 20% is not extraordinarily high. It's not even extraordinarily low. Some are even lower than that. They're trying to get to 20%, but what we're able to do here, being a PAYGO city, and since our capital expenditures can fluctuate from year to year, if we didn't have any cash reserves that we could use, that means we'd have to adjust revenues up and down every year. So we'd either have to increase rates and then the next year decrease rates, but then what we use, as I said, a balancing account becomes our reserve funds. And fortunately, we have those reserve funds that we're able to utilize in addition to our revenues to meet those needs.
Thank you.
Councilmember Fuller.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to get kind of this in my head better. The external services that you have listed there, those are external coming from where?
Contract providers, either through purchase power, purchase water, or the company that does our solid waste recovery, pickup and disposal.
But the money comes from the utility?
It comes from our rates, but we pay it out to other providers.
Okay. So where the internal would just be, our own costs. Okay. So
our employees and then bills that come through the city's finance department to pay upon approval by council.
So right now, as we have it, the city, when we purchase our power, water, all our utility services, it's completely paid by rates.
Yes.
So the city right now does not pay for any of its use. The rate users do.
It doesn't come from the general fund, it comes from all of the users, the customers of the utility.
Right, but we don't charge ourselves as a customer.
Ask your question again.
Okay, but the city doesn't charge itself its own customer. The money comes in from rate users.
Yes,
Other than the city.
including city, there are some of the users are city accounts. So they pay those rates, they pay rates as well. So, but all that cost.
Right, so like if we had an external fund, like our airport, whatever, that would pay for that portion.
It comes from any property or citizen that is a utility customer.
Okay, so right now, for instance, if we just pulled out just the city's use of utilities for utilities used by the city for their properties, would that be comparable to the 1.4 franchise fee, or do we even know what that would be?
If you can hold that, we can get into the cost of service, because I think that
you break it down there?
You'll see what it will essentially, it offsets what the increase in cost would be if we paid if city accounts paid the full cost of service.
Okay, because it is one thing to say there's not been a history of us doing so. So we shouldn't start now. But on the other hand, the city needs to be responsible too, and not just pay, spend whatever it wants on, water or utilities too. There should be some accounting as what we're using as a city as well. So if you have that broken up in the future, we'll talk about that there. Thank you.
One last question I have
Yes,
is
sir.
If we, for every dollar in revenue that is collected via the utilities, how much of that goes towards reserves? So in any given year, how much of the total revenue that we collect from the ratepayers are we able to set aside as reserves In other words, I guess we would have to take capital projects out of the equation and just say for these other things, the external services, the internal services, the general fund services, if we add up those expenses and subtract that from our revenues, how much is left over each year?
Well, we also have the debt service to pay.
And that's a fixed cost.
And so, and we're going to start, and we're increasing the $600,000 each year for accelerated repayment on those bonds. So I'd say that looking just at the bottom line here, and we go to the next page, it'll be from a numerical standpoint, but over the next 6 years, there will be no money coming from current revenues to build reserves. We're going to be using the money, all the money that ratepayers pay, plus money that we have in our reserves to meet the overall program. So that's why it goes from a 104% down to 39% in the 2026. So we won't be, there's no money during this period that we be going back into reserves. It's going to be used, that money will be used for capital improvements, and then we'll be using additional money from reserves to pay for capital improvements. So if we took capital improvements out altogether, it kind of muddies the waters a bit in determining what, because really, based on our forecast, there will not be additional money going into reserves during this period.
So how much in deficit are we then each year?
We haven't done a pro forma income statement, but to the extent that, so if you take a look, if we look at 2022, for example, if we have $30 million in revenue, we'll have $22 million in expenses based on what we have forecasted here. Then that would mean we'd have about 7.4 million of net operating income. But then as far as the deficit, we have depreciation expense. Yeah, so income statement gets a little odd on this thing, but as far as just cash flow deficit, we're going to spend $6 million. So in that case, so we have so it's going to be so if we have 30 million minus 22.9, so I say 23, that's 7 million. We're going to spend, actually we're going to spend 6.1 million for capital improvements. So actually we would have 900,000. We have 112,000 going, so about 800,000 would actually be going into reserves. That's why I misspoke. So there's going to be some ups and downs during this period, but there would be 800,000. And we could probably add that if that would be helpful in that kind of presentation for you, so you could see what that total, the activity within the funds and where the money comes and goes.
And again, my concern is when we look at statements like this, first off, it appears we have a tremendous amount of money in reserve, this cash on hand. So we're going to spend that down. I understand that. But it's the rate that we spend that down, and then once it is spent down, what happens? I mean, I wouldn't want to see in year 6 some other council, because I won't be here, but in year 6, do we all of a sudden go to the citizens and say, oh, well, that last council didn't do very well, so here's a 30% rate hike?
That is always possible. Looking out 6 years, so if we can let's go to the next page. Maybe this will be helpful, because I think it'll help clarify some things. This is really what the fund balances are projected to be at the end of each year. So if we look at the unrestricted fund balances, so at the end of fiscal year 20, that's the 30.6. Then at the end of fiscal year 21, it goes down to 20.3. Then it goes up to 21.3, and then it goes back on its downward trend. So at the end of the period, will be at 10.3. So what I would recommend, that rather than putting this off on the shelf and never looking at it again, that this council and future councils always be updating this. Their staff will have a model that they can do this projection forecast and then report back to you, well, here's what things look like. And it used to be pretty common for cities to look at just budget year to budget year. And we really asked them to start looking at a 5-year period, but even a 5-year period, the problem is what happens in year 6? Now, fortunately, as Dennis mentioned, our backbone expenditures for capital improvements should be done. But then Dennis and successor utility directors will be examining the need for capital improvements, both in terms of updated condition assessments and will we need to spend more money in the future. But we don't anticipate at this point any significant major capital improvement plans out in the future. There are other risks, as was noted earlier, with regard to things that could happen that can either increase our energy costs or reduce our ability to purchase energy at a reasonable price that we need to be prepared for. And these fund balances can provide a lot of assurance that we have cash, both in terms of the rate stabilization fund, but I really wouldn't want to target a fund balance that gets down to the 20% level. It'd probably be better to be a little bit higher than that.
Okay, and again, that's my concern. And I'm not sure how we can look at that. I mean, obviously it needs to be looked at each year. There could be an unforeseen capital cost that occurs, something breaks that we don't expect to break. I think the problem is we're starting out with so much money, and there are so many large projects that were put off for years. Well, those things are going to take care of themselves now. We're going to see that reserve go down, and we're going to see those large projects get taken care of. So I understand that's what you're saying is the capital outlay each year should flatten out at a much more manageable level. But still, how much of a reserve are we burning through each year as we approach the end of that 5-year? Although it appears there are some years where we're actually putting more into the reserve.
And it'll just be 1 year, which is in fiscal year 22. So after that, we'll be continuing to take money out of the reserve, and it's not very, so we'll go from 21.9 down to 19.9, down to 15, down to 13.8, and then down to 10.3. And at the 10.3, we'd be at 39% of O&M, and I wouldn't want to go much below that. So that means, so what does that mean for fiscal year 27? Well, it may mean that we may need a nominal rate increase. Maybe it's going to be a 5% overall rate increase on all 3 utilities, so water, wastewater, and electric. But it's difficult to say. I wouldn't want to project out and set a rate for 2027 at this point.
And I'm looking at let's say starting in 2022, you've got 21.3, 19.9, 15. So, just roughly about $3 million a year difference as we go through those years.
Yes, and then again it goes down to 13.8, which is about 1.2 million, and then another $3.5 million reduction, which and most of it comes from the balances on pay-go capital. So it's what the projected expenditures are in those years. So if expenditures don't happen as quickly, then as forecast, then there wouldn't be as quick a reduction in the fund balances.
Right. And knowing the great job that Dennis has done in prioritizing those things, there's a possibility that if something were to come up, we're getting the most important things out of the way now and leaving the least important things for later. We may have to say, we're going to put that off for 2 years. So there's that possibility that projects become less critical to the system and could be put off for a year or two.
So the projects could be less urgent in nature and you can have more flexibility in phasing and scheduling future work. So I think you're correct in that.
All right. Thank you. Councilmember Folda?
Thank you, guys. A quick comment on that is that, I don't believe that we really had in the past a real capital improvement plan for our utilities as far as future use. And I think that's something that's been worked on now. We have Dennis here, is that, we know, if this utility is good for this amount of time, then we can start budgeting and working towards that in the future. I don't think, we had, it's been 50 years old and now we got to suddenly fix something before something catastrophic happens. So I think with this new budget, although we're still seeing some of that with these huge projects, I think that might also balance out in the future where we won't have such a spike up and down as far as improvement because of future planning more appropriately.
And again, from what I've seen in the past, those large projects were always out there. They just weren't being done. Money got budgeted each year, but then the project wasn't done. So we wind up with a tremendous amount of money in the reserve, but these large projects that are becoming critical to the system.
Yeah, so what happened in the past, if you set rates in anticipation that you're going to spend a lot of money on projects, and you budget those projects and the projects didn't happen, the rates were already set, customers are already paying, and so that money goes into the bank account, and it's sitting idle in the bank account waiting to be used. And so now I think we're at a point where we can actually use that money. Where did that money come from? It came from prior years and rates that customers have paid into the system.
Okay.
And I might also add that many cities are doing what Dennis has started with, this condition assessments. When you think about our infrastructure, one thing a lot of our energy infrastructure is above ground, and so it's easier to go out and see condition of poles and wires and insulators, so we can see what's going on and more visible. But we have water and wastewater infrastructure that's underground, and it's difficult to see what's going on. So some cities, they wait till water lines break and then they know they have a problem. And then they are faced now with some significant investment to rehabilitate that underground linear infrastructure, which is a real challenge. So many cities are doing asset management plans, which include a condition assessment, but really to take a look, what is the condition of our infrastructure, and when do we anticipate that we will need to spend money to rehabilitate the system? So do we wait until things blow up, or do we start a intentional plan to put money into the system each year? And so we look at different metrics. It's like the average age of a water line. Washington, D.C., their average age of their water distribution system is about 75 to 80 years old. And they would like it to be an average of 50 years. Well, to get from 80 to 50 is going to be a huge investment just to slowly get that average down. So it's better and the whole idea of doing asset management planning is to really try to look into the future. Because the one thing we know in utility is that it's difficult or impossible for us to do just-in-time infrastructure delivery. We have to plan ahead. If we're a growing community and we have to deal with growth, what are we going to need in the future? How much additional capacity are we going to need? If our community is not growing as much, it's going to be, we can redirect our focus on when do we need to start reinvesting in this aging infrastructure. It's not getting younger every day, unlike many of us. So okay. Maybe we can go on to maybe some of the next issue. I want to talk a little bit, and I'm going to ask Colin to come up and talk a little more about cost of service. But the issue is raised, so right now we're recommending a rate reduction. And when will that go into place? It'll go in place when if the council wants to do it, that's when it will happen. But then there's the whole issue of cost of service. And that puts some other monkey wrenches in the overall plan of things. And we'll get into the details of what does it mean, cost of service? What are the policy decisions that the city council will need to make relative to charging cost of service based rates? What are our options? And we'll get into three alternative options that we believe the City Council has before them. So with that, I'm going to ask Colin to come up and get into more detail on the cost of service.
Okay, so everything we've been talking about up to this point relates to the total amount of revenue that is coming into the utility funds. So the primary conclusion in terms of that is that we don't need any additional revenue in total. In fact, depending on how things shake out, based on what we can see now, it looks like we could actually maybe reduce revenues a little bit. What the cost of service deals with is the distribution of that revenue among the various types of customers within our city. Residential, commercial, and the city accounts are kind of the three primary types that you can think of. So for a given amount of overall revenue, think of a total bucket, how do we distribute that bucket to the different types of users depending on how they use our system? So that's what cost of service gets into, is slicing the pie. So what we've told you is the size of the pie is probably okay. Maybe it could get a little smaller. And now we need to slice it up. So that's the task of the cost of service study. So just a little bit of overview on that. That is the way it's a common way of determining rates throughout the United States for electric, water, and wastewater utilities. It informs us about the cost of providing service to different types of customers. So we're not talking about what does it cost us in total. We're saying if I'm a residential customer and I use the city's electric system and water system in this way, I cause the city to have to design and operate a certain amount of infrastructure to meet that demand. And other types of customers use the city's electric, water, and wastewater system differently. Apparently we've got a test going on here. Or Amber Alert. Usually I get a text. Must be local. So if you think about it in an extreme sense, you could say, well, we could determine the cost to serve each individual customer. So my house is here. It's so far away from the wastewater treatment plant. That's X miles of collection system, and that's my rate. But that's not super practical. So typically what we do is we group customers into classes based on the way they use the system. So here we have residential, commercial, and the city are kind of the three biggest types. And within commercial, especially on the electric side, there's a lot more. But so what we do is we group those customers based on their demand characteristics. And the task of the cost of service study is to say, based on their demands, what does it cost to, what proportion of the costs should they be allocated? I think I hit those other two things. The only other thing I'd add that's not on here is there is not a requirement to set rates based on cost of service. Cost of service informs us about what the differences are between the cost to serve different types of customer classes and the revenues that we're currently recovering from them. We don't have to set rates based on cost of service. We were asked to do a cost of service study, so we've got that for you, and we're taking a look at that. If we want to go to cost of service, there are adjustments that would need to be made. Some customers are paying too little and some are paying too much. So when you back up to the overall financial plan, the answer is we don't need any more money. When you go to cost of service, within that bucket, it appears that some classes are paying too much and some too little. So that's where that 5-year phase-in comes in, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And this just, I guess, it kind of gets right to the summary here. So on the electric side, there's a bunch of customer classes and a lot of numbers here, but the bottom line is the difference between that column that says FY 2022 reduced rates and FY 2022 cost of service. So the reduced rate column is after the 3% reduction in energy rates that we mentioned earlier. The FY 2022 cost of service is the distribution of that overall $15.9 million to the different customer classes based on the cost of service study, which reflects the different types of customer demands. So what we're seeing here is there is an imbalance between the revenue that we're currently generating or would generate under the lower rates and the cost to serve each customer and the cost to serve certain customer classes. And the primary difference, even though there are a lot of classes here, is between residential and what I'll call non-residential, which is kind of grouping most of those other commercial groupings together. So you can see that residential is, their cost of service is 13.5% higher than what they would generate under those reduced rates, the slightly reduced rates. And then on the commercial side, they would actually, we're actually getting more revenue from them than the cost of service study is showing that should be recovered from them if we were to set rates purely based on cost of service. So the question then becomes, and this applies to all three, mostly to water, is how do we get there if we want to do something? If we want to make a change and set rates based on cost of service, we'll need to get 13.5% more from residential and less from all the non-residential customers. As I mentioned, overall, we're not getting any more money. We're recovering the same level of revenue. It's about the distribution of that revenue. And that is a policy decision of the city to move to this or not. And I will say that we're going to show a few options, but there's a kind of a broad spectrum of potential things you could do. I mean, this is what we kind of consider a guidepost. So if we were going to go all the way, here's what it would look like. Our kind of initial recommendation is if you want to do this, then let's phase it in over 5 years. And the fact that we don't need any more revenue actually really helps us because the impact of that is a lot smaller. The only other thing I'd point out here is we have the issue of city accounts, which we'll get into. It's a bigger issue on the water side, but it's also true of the electric. If you look at that city electric and then city streetlights, there's a pretty significant difference between the amount of revenue we get and cost of service, and that's because right now, as the mayor mentioned, we choose to give ourselves a break, us being the city accounts, on utility service by charging the wholesale cost of power. We don't charge for streetlights, and they're not metered, so that's part of that. So if we were to charge for streetlights, that would be an additional $140,000, and then you can see there's an increase in electric costs to reflect the full cost, not just buying the power, but also distributing it. The full cost to city accounts would be the $441,000 there. And this issue comes up again on the water side. But on the electric side, the big kind of policy question is, given that these imbalances exist, do we want to make adjustments to the residential and non-residential rates? And then that same question on the city, we want to continue the current policy of charging the wholesale cost of power or move the city accounts to cost of service. And then looking at, I forgot I had this one in here. So what this slide is intended to demonstrate is the impact of maintaining what we have. So we did the determination for the city accounts, and basically what we're doing here is we're saying, if we want to maintain our current approach for the city, what are the differences that result from that? So what we do in that third column called adjustment is we reduce the city cost of service to what they're currently paying essentially, and then spread that out to all the other customer classes to calculate an adjusted cost of service. When you compare that to what they're currently paying, that's those last two columns there. So just as an example, residential needed to be, there's a 13.5% difference. That difference grows if the city maintains itself at the status quo. Again, that's if we want to go to cost of service. And then on the non-residential side, those reductions or differences become smaller. So this is just another way of thinking about it. If we want to keep what we have, what we would do is essentially redistribute that additional cost that was going to city accounts to everyone else kind of in proportion to their cost of service. And this is the slide I expected to see. I forgot I had that other one in there. So on the water side, this is where the city kind of, we'll call the city policy question, city account policy question has the biggest impact. The city, as everyone knows, is a big user of water, and that's a choice we've made. And the question is, how do we want to pay for that, and how should that cost be recovered? Historically, we've done the wholesale cost of water on the water side. If we wanted to charge the full cost, not just buying the water, but distributing it, that would be reflected in pretty substantial increases to the cost that city accounts pay. So if you look in that far right column, the raw water increase is about 1.3 million, and then the potable water is just under 900,000. So we're talking about earlier the increase from the central services and the addition of the franchise fee. I think between this and electric, on an annual basis, it's actually a little bit higher, so they don't wash completely. But I think one of the reasons that the franchise fee was considered is to potentially balance that issue of if we do this to the city accounts, that money has to come from somewhere. And it could, potentially present challenges for the general fund to increase the rates that much. So the question is, I think that maybe the thing to keep in mind is if we do this without doing the franchise fee, that represents a significant additional cost to the general fund for those city accounts. And the result of that is that everyone else essentially pays a little less in terms of what they pay for their water rates. And then the next slide shows that same kind of look. So even if we take the city out of the equation and say we just leave them where they are, there are still some imbalances in cost of service, which you can see in that column that's second from the right. So residential's paying a little bit too much, and commercial is a little bit too low. And then Cascada has their own rate, and theirs they actually go from a reduction to an increase. And the biggest reason for that is that raw water group essentially needs to be paying more in total, and to the extent that the city doesn't pick up its share of raw water, that impacts what's left over to have a cost of service rate for Cascada. Okay. And the easiest one, there's not a ton of difference on the wastewater side. Wastewater costs are driven primarily by the strength of wastewater flow. We don't really have super high strength customers here. A lot of the cost is a lot of the cost differentiation really relates to strength, and there's not much difference between the different types of customers. The city's a much smaller impact on the wastewater side because most of the water that the city uses is not returned to the wastewater system. It's mostly irrigation.
So might wait for any questions. And I might also point out that on the city water accounts, the golf courses make up the proportionate, the maximum amount of, I don't know what percentage they are. It's
maybe
like
70%.
70. It's on the raw water, it's all golf course, I think, isn't it? City raw?
No.
No, okay.
Veterans Park.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
But
It's most of it.
But the golf courses are quite a large percentage of that total city account cost of water service. So what's interesting is that on the electric side, for residential, the residential's underpaying on electric by about the same amount they're overpaying on water. So for the total bill, as long as you're using a proportionate amount, it's about a wash, but it's imbalance between electric and water from that standpoint. And the other thing is on the city street lighting, we don't charge now. The city doesn't pay for city street lighting. That's a benefit that's provided to all citizens with street lighting. And so what this is the estimated cost of, we don't meter each of those lights. So we've had to estimate the amount of energy used for street lighting. So it's a relatively nominal amount in the total scheme of things, but that's another one of those city cost pool things that right now the city's not paying for that.
A question I have about any cost of service analysis is there are certain assumptions that go into how you arrive at that cost. Something that I believe is the case, and these rates, the differences in these rates have been this way for many years. In order to get power to a business, it generally costs more per user because of the equipment that's needed. So whereas a transformer on a pole here may service 4 residences, and it's a relatively small, less expensive transformer than one business may need. They may need a very large transformer that services only that property. It's a more expensive piece of equipment. So can you discuss what type of assumptions went into these cost of service analysis?
Sure, I'll ask Colin to come up and get into that, but you are correct. It requires us to look at, for electric, we look at what are the nature of the costs, how do we essentially functionalize the cost into different cost components, and how do each customer use those assets, and how do the demands that they place. So one is load factor. Every customer has a different load factor, and certainly the commercial users, that particularly the higher energy demand users, have a higher cost, and that's reflected in the assumptions that were made and the analysis that we did. So, Colin?
So a couple things on that. There's 2 things going on. You could split it into the cost of the infrastructure required to serve the customer. So, of course, residential customer there may be more than one on a transformer, whereas a commercial customer may have its own transformer. So those things are kind of broken up, and we're working on a detailed tech memo that will explain how those are built up. But essentially, that's reflected in higher costs per customer for those components that we're assuming for non-residential versus residential. The biggest driver is the consistency with which the power is used, which drives the size of the infrastructure and what's needed to deliver the power. And this is true on the water side as well. So on the electric side, we have load factors, which are a measure of how consistently they use power. On the water side, we have peaking factors. So a customer that uses power more consistently requires less oversizing, less capacity of infrastructure to serve them. So given that we have to build a system with sufficient capacity to serve everyone with all of their usage characteristics, a good portion of of the overall cost of distributing the power is related to that capacity. So the customers that use the power less consistently will be allocated a bigger share of those costs because we essentially need more to deal with that peak. You can kind of think of it like a highway, and the need to meet kind of have enough lanes for rush hour traffic. Whereas if everyone, if it was a kind of a consistent flow rather than everyone trying to use it at once, you wouldn't need as much infrastructure there. So that's the biggest difference. One thing we observed, and we actually mentioned this in the first presentation, typically non-residential rates are lower because they are more consistent users of power. Now here, they're really not that different, but the one thing we observed is, so that the way they use power isn't so different. It's just that the rates, if you look at the average cost per kilowatt hour, we're actually charging, when it all shakes out, we're actually charging our non-residential customers a little bit more than our residential customers on an average cost per kilowatt hour basis. And that's kind of the reverse of the way our cost structure usually is. So what this is just a reflection of trying to realign those things. And that's true of the water as well, although the biggest issue on the water is the city piece.
I know when these series of rate increases were instituted, I believe starting in 2016, within those rates or the rate increases, there was a leveling between commercial and residential that was occurring. In other words, the residential rates were being increased at a faster rate than the commercial were. So there should have already been some equilibrium over these last several years where these rate increases have been imposed. Right. And again, I'm curious about these assumptions, because changing an assumption a little bit could change those differences significantly. In other words, where residential is being shown to be charged or paying 16%, I believe, would need to be an increase, whereas a business might get a break of 44%.
Right.
Like I say, I'm curious about those assumptions because those seem to be significant differences between the two.
Right.
And the fact that businesses here in Boulder City, they're pretty much open using energy during the peak hours, whereas residential, that period of time might be spread out more over the course of the day.
Well, we looked at, so on the electric side, we looked at monthly data as well as system peak information. The one thing I guess I would say is that they really, actually, I have a graph, maybe I'll throw it in a future report or something. If you look at the usage patterns, they're really not that different. It's just that the rates are different. And despite the fact that we have had increased residential rates more in this last round of increases, of course, we haven't done to my knowledge, haven't done a cost of service study before. We did notice an imbalance, I guess, and made that adjustment. But if we hadn't done that, then things would potentially be even further out of whack relative to what we have. So in terms of the sensitivity of the assumptions, it certainly has an impact, but it's less about how different they are and more about how different the rates are relative to how similar the customer's usage patterns are. So they really don't use it that different. It's just the rates are set as though they're quite different.
And again, I believe that was always the assumption, and that's why these rate structures have been this way for decades.
Right.
That commercial paid an amount higher than residential because it was assumed or believed or shown, I'm not sure how it got that way, but that those customers put higher demands on the system and therefore their rates were set at a higher level.
And I think that may be the case at some point. We were not, the last study done by EES was not a cost of service study. It was kind of an across the board adjustment. So it predates that, and we didn't ever see a copy of that cost of service, whatever the basis for that. But I think your assumption is correct that that was the premise that was used in establishing the rates back in the day that it was established. But what the data is showing us now is that the load factors between the classes are not significantly different, and that our energy consumption, our energy purchases are less driven by peak demand requirements as they are just the total energy that we use. So it's in part it's how the costs are allocated, but it's also where we are relative to the rates. So the basis for the existing rates had a premise that there would be a lot bigger difference in the impact on a commercial customer than on a residential customer with regard to that cost of service than what the data is showing us today.
All right. I'm hesitant to fix a problem that has existed for decades all at one time, and the fix is to put the burden on the residents and say, well, businesses, you've been at this rate, we're going to come close to cutting your rates in half, and residents, we're going to boost your rate up based on some assumptions that may or may not be the same across the system. But I do appreciate the explanation of it. And
I think that as Colin indicated, we're working now on a technical memorandum that would cover the details of the cost of service analysis. So it would be able to inform you as the basis for the data that we're looking at and how that data is used in determining cost of service. So one of the things is that over time, the validity of data that we're able to get in an analysis is much better today than what it was 20 years ago or whenever that last cost of service study was done. So had to be a lot.
If there was one.
If there was, but yeah, certainly the underlying premise, well, typically we would think that commercial customers would be placing higher demands relative to residential, but we're not seeing that. And even when we take into account the level of infrastructure that's used down to the customer level, that cost is not driving the bulk of our electric costs. We have a lot of it that is our purchase energy that is just based on the number of kilowatt hours, preponderant share that is the kilowatt hours that we purchase. So that could be part of the driving. But that gets into some of so where do we go from here relative to what are the outcomes we would like to achieve relative to making changes, if any? And
one last question then on the water. When you're looking at those differences between commercial and residential, is the service charge factored into that or just the cost of the water itself?
It includes the whole cost of service, so it includes the components related to meter reading, billing, and collection. And then, of course, the SNWA service charge is a separate thing that's based on meter size, so it's all reflected in that analysis of cost of service.
Okay, what I'm getting at is, all the residents currently pay $35 service charge. They may use 2,000, 5,000 gallons. A business, they're being charged that service fee as well, connection fee, but they could be using 5,000 gallons, or 25,000 gallons. So again, what I'm getting at is, so the connection fee, the service fee, plus the cost of water was all assumed to be what the total cost of service is?
Yes, and in that base service charge are the costs of meter reading the water meters, preparing and sending the bill, collecting the payments, following up with customer service, and dealing with that component of cost. So there's not a readiness to serve component related to some portion of the infrastructure that would be included in that. So in that $30 residential, how much of that is SNWA? 12 of that 30 is what SNWA charges us based on the number of accounts we have and the size of the accounts.
Well, they need the capital to grow their system. I mean, that's what that charge is.
Right.
It's paying off things like the third straw and all of that.
So that leads to, say we have $28. That's what we're charging for base service charge for residential. And when we looked at the meter reading, billing, and collection components of costs that are typically recovered in a base service charge, that's how we came up with we could reduce that by $10 and still cover our costs.
All right. Councilmember Adams?
Thank you. I did just want to point out one thing. I guess it's more of a comment, but when we talk about, we're breaking down things, looking at residential versus commercial, things like that. I mean, just in residential, there are vast differences between the amount that is used by some residences versus some that are used by others. Whether or not they've got more native or desert landscaping versus whether they've got big lush green gardens and stuff like that. So I do want to, when we are in a situation, as has been pointed out earlier, in which we should be wanting to encourage a little bit more conservatism with how much we are using. And so, just for, I guess, something that we should consider is, how do we want to treat those who use so much versus those who use very little, and how should that reflect in what gets paid and how we cover all these costs?
So we do have a modest inclining block rate that we would maintain, but the question is it achieving the outcomes that you would like? And it gets back into this issue, and while Colin indicated that, well, in Nevada, we're not required to follow cost of service by statute. Other states are, and the courts use that as a basis for determining fairness and equity of rates. So California, they actually have they had a constitutional amendment, Proposition 218, that the citizens approved that requires municipal water in wastewater utilities to set rates based on cost of service. And the Supreme Court has confirmed that constitutional amendment. That is the California Supreme Court. Other states, state of Michigan, the jurisprudence in Michigan, when cities have been challenged about their rates, they go back to, are the rates reasonable in relation to the cost of service? But in the end, what we have as an elected governing board of the city, you have a lot of leeway to make legislative decisions as the governing body of this city. And so even in states that require or look to having cost of service, they're not talking about exactly cost of service, they just have to be reasonable rates. And are the rates reasonable and not arbitrary and capricious? Are they unreasonable, so we're not doing anything? And the decisions that this council will make are all deliberations and deliberative in process that supports the decisions that this council will make going forward. So I think that's an important element to remember on that whole issue of cost of service. And as Colin indicated, cost of service is really, it's a guidepost for us to look at, and it informs us, but it doesn't say, unless the city chose to do it, to say, hey, this is what we want to do. But there may be other reasons, policy decisions that need to be incorporated. So I want to get into some of the recommendations that we have and really what the flexibility that you have in the decisions that you'll make. So on the electric utility side, we believe that, particularly given the COVID situation, that it would be appropriate to reduce electric, and we have the financial capability to reduce energy rates by 3% for all customers beginning this current year. So we think that would be a reasonable thing for the city council to consider, and then take that going forward. And then as it relates to cost of service, we would maintain the monthly customer charges and demand charges, would not change those at all between now and 2026. But then if we go to cost of service by class, that's for all classes, and whether we do it for all classes including city accounts or all classes excluding city accounts, that you consider phasing it in slowly over a 5-year period. So that it would be from 2022 through 2026, so that those adjustments would not happen all at once if we were going to do that. So that would be on the electric side. Likewise, on the water side, we recommend a $10 per month reduction in the fixed service charge for all of our water customers. What that means is our residential customers are typically 5/8 and 1-inch meters. So the larger meters would get bigger reductions based on the capacity factors that we have been used historically for elevating the fixed service charges for those customers as well. Then there's some differences now between residential and non-residential fixed charges that we couldn't justify, so we believe that they should be equalized. Again, thinking about the cost of reading a meter, sending a bill, and collecting that bill, that process does not change because it's a commercial customer as opposed to a residential customer. So we think those customers ought to be treated similarly. Likewise, we would maintain the monthly fixed charge constant through fiscal year 26. And then if we move to cost of service, again, whether we move to cost of service for all customers or move cost of service to everyone exclusive of the city accounts, consider a 5-year phase into that, so there's not any immediate rate shock resulting from going to cost of service. So what that means is that however the council determines what that cost of service level we want to get, the customers that would pay cost of service, we wouldn't achieve that until 2026.
And just a question that kind of relates to what Councilmember Adams had brought up. I believe already within the electric rates, those are tiered. So if you cross over a certain threshold, your cost per kilowatt hour is going to go up. And, whether that's based on attempting to get people to conserve, or just the fact that because they're putting a bigger demand on the system, they're being charged a higher amount, which I'm sure that was the original reason for that. But I don't believe we have that in the water system, do we? There is
Yes.
because again, when I look at how much we pay per gallon and the fact that we live in the desert, it seems like we're getting an awfully good deal per gallon. And I don't know how Boulder City compares with other communities as far as gallons per household, but I think that's something we might also want to look at.
Our per capita usage in Boulder City, all in, is pretty substantial compared to other communities in the region. So sometimes there's some challenges in how you look at the data, but our usage, and that is included in the tech memo, a table that shows that our per capita consumption. And SNWA is working with all their communities trying to get people to reduce that per capita water consumption. But there's a lot of reasons why, whether if we include the raw water, if we exclude the raw water, and even the amount of irrigation that we do with potable water is substantial, but it's also something that makes Boulder City, gives it the ambiance that I think you desire by having the landscape irrigated in a way that is appropriate.
And, that's why they call us Clean Green Boulder City, but we still live in the desert, so thank you.
Yep.
Councilmember Bridges?
Yeah, thank you. On your slide, rate recommendations for electric. Okay, I'm trying to go back into whether we're reducing rates or increasing rates. Are these three exclusive options, or are you recommending all three, which would really create a net increase?
Well,
for example, our residential users of electricity, if we're going to increase our rates to achieve cost of service by class by 2026, and we're talking about reducing the rate, and it says maintain. So are these three different options, or are you recommending some sort of aggregate amount between the three?
Okay. So 1 and 2 go together.
Okay.
So we recommend that we could go ahead and reduce rates by energy rates by 3%. We can do that today, and then full speed ahead, just go where we are. The next thing is, well, what happens if we desire to get to cost of service? And we need to increase, if the council decides we want to get to cost of service by 2026, or maybe sometime later than that, but we want to start making adjustments. When would those adjustments be made, and how would that impact? But to the extent that those adjustments require an increase to rates charged to residential customers, that would start increasing their rates relative to the 3% reduction. So if the first phase was 2 years from now to increase residential rates by 3%, they'd be where they are today. But then we'd be on that path. But that would be dependent upon the decision that the council makes relative to, do we want to get to cost of service for electric and water? Because I think it'll be important, if the council chose to go to cost of service, the messaging to citizens is going to be important that they have to take a look at electric and water combined. Because the electric bill may go up, but their water bill could go down.
Okay. So it's A and B, or 1 and 2, or 1 and 2 and 3, but the problem with 1 and 2, or 3 and 1, which would add every year a percentage, what was electricity, 13% difference? I think
Yeah, so if we're going to
13.5% difference.
So if we're going to do it over 5 years, it would be, say, nominally 2.5% increase each year or so.
So basically, they'd get a 0.5% discount or a half.
At whatever point we started doing it, and then it would go away over time.
And then all that.
Right.
Okay. So because I wasn't sure when it said in 2026, meaning if that was the beginning of the increase to cost of service or whether that was the.
That would be the end.
The end.
Yeah,
to cost of.
based on, since we're all of our planning and forecasting was out to 2026, so we're kind of using that as the end point, but you're not required to use that as an end point. But we can maybe talk a little more about that when I get to other options and considerations that you'll need to debate and consider, if I may.
Thank you.
Okay. So on wastewater rates, here we just want to, there's some nuance thing, just maintain the residential charges through 26 because we charge residential customers a fixed rate for wastewater. Don't see any changes in that. We think there need to be, need to consolidate the commercial. We have an inclining block wastewater rate for commercial customers. There's really not a basis for that. There's not a rate-making foundation for that. So we say, well, we just clean that up and just go to a consolidated rate, uniform rate, beginning in fiscal year 22. So not until next year would start that. So then what issues do we want to consider? So consider the 3% reduction in energy costs, the water-based charge, $10 reduction in the water-based service charge, and then equalize the residential and non-residential fixed charges. Consider whether or not to increase the central service fee from $1,025,000 per year, which is the current resolution, assuming that you would maintain that going forward, but then possibly increase that to $1.4 million. Likewise, consider implementing a franchise fee of 5%. Again, we're not recommending that you do that. We offer that for consideration by the council. So we're agnostic, really looking for city policy decision to provide us direction. I will say that if those two things aren't done, then the fund balance in the forecast will end up the period larger than what we have on the slide deck here. So that 39% would be higher at the end of 2026. So then with the options we have, do a phase-in full cost of service, 5-year phase-in. We could do the adjusted cost of service, maintain city accounts under current resolution, which is electric is the average cost of energy purchased, and water is the cost of wholesale water provided by SNWA. Maintain that, but then go to cost of service for everything else, for all other customers in a 5-year period. Or, once we reduce rates in option 1, just stay the course where we are now, don't make any other changes, and revisit this at some point in the future, whether it be in 2026 or beforehand, or wait for, as you get updates annually or periodically going forward, just keep your eye on the ball and say, hey, we need to revisit things. We don't have to do anything now. We're in good financial position today. We don't have to make any big rate increases now to dig us out of a hole. We're in good shape. We can fund our capital improvements. We've got a good handle on the capital improvement program now. Dennis has done a fine job working with the advisory committee and his staff and really getting arms around what our capital investments need to be for the backbone system, and then starting that renewal and replacement on an annual basis. So you're fortunate that you don't have a big hole that we have to dig out of, and we have a big liquidity issue that will keep us up at night. You have plenty of other things that can keep you up at night. So utilities doesn't have to be part of it. So with that, we can continue on with any other questions or contemplation that you may have, but you have something to think about, and we will be, kind of our plans, We have to do the tech memo on the cost of service. We have to continue to work with the advisory committee, responding to their detailed questions with regard to the data that we use. Mr. Mayor, I think we will I think we have some information on cost of service that we can provide to you and the council members. If that would be, it's also that preliminary cost of service presentation that we did to the advisory committee back in December has some good detail on the assumptions that were made in that cost service, and you can go that I think is still posted on the website, so that you can go back and review that. And then we need your advice relative to how to button this up, because our plan initially was that we would be dealing with the advisory committee and the council in your budget deliberations for this year in May, and that would have been done in May. But due to COVID, we've all been dealing with a lot of other issues and trying to balance things. But so here we are now, and we have better information today than we would have had in May, because we had the end of fiscal year, June 30th, we have preliminary information that really informs us quite well with regard to what our fund balances are today.
And, there are some things, and they're kind of oddities. The hospital, for instance, has just installed a significant number of solar panels that should reduce their power consumption considerably. We're in the process of doing the municipal golf course, tying that into the raw water system, which it was not previously. They're going to be doing some work there, from what I understand, or at least it's planned, to remove a lot of the turf that's there currently being watered and replace that with xeriscape. So there are some things like that. I don't see that as having a huge impact on the information you have. But there are some things, as you say, we need to keep an eye on what's happening so we understand the changes that occurred. I myself would be very interested in seeing your cost of service breakdown and see how that looks, because as I say, the last 4 rate increases were intended to go higher on residential and lower on commercial. So we're still showing, at least, based on your assessment, a significant difference between those two, where businesses would get a substantial change downward and residents would get at least an appreciable change upward. So again, be willing to look at that. The way our agenda is structured today, I don't know that we're able to really provide you with any direction, but I certainly do appreciate it. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Anyone from the committee or Dr. Ree?
Yeah, so I had sort of three comments, and I certainly want to be respectful. I respect the utility people. I don't want to take up too much time saying how much I respect everybody, but it's genuine. They fixed the power lines on my street in a rainstorm at 2 in the morning while I was in bed. It's so my criticism.
Just be careful who you make fun of. So.
Well, I'm not going to make fun of anyone, but our job is to be a bit skeptical, at least for me as a scientist. So here are 3 of my comments that make me a bit skeptical of this whole exercise. First of all, the conclusions seem to be the conclusions of the city rather than the consultant. We were told before this exercise began, well, we're not going to raise the rates next year. Then the recommendation comes in, we're not going to raise the rates. When asked the consultant for details about the franchise fee and the justification, the specific justification for how that money was going to be spent in the general fund, I was told to ask the finance director. Well, in my naive mind, the finance director should be awaiting the recommendations of the consultant, not explaining to me the recommendations of the consultant, which they couldn't explain to me. So it makes me a bit skeptical of sort of cart before the horse. Are we looking at sort of recommendations the city is recommending to itself? Here's what we'd like to do. Maybe, maybe not. Well, you might say it doesn't matter as long as the recommendations are good. So forget it, you know. But my second point is with the numbers. So the numbers are given to incredible precision in these reports, to the dollar, to the kilowatt hour. And precision can create the illusion of accuracy. They're two different things. I can tell you that, you know, there's 160,217 residents in Boulder City. Incredible precision to the resident, but completely inaccurate. It's off by a factor 10. So when I look at, for example, the amount of electricity that we used in 2017, in the consultant's report, it says 159 kilowatt hours, 159,389,200 kilowatt hours. When I look in Mr. Dwyer's report, it says 151,664,969 kilowatt hours. That's a difference of almost 10 million kilowatt hours in numbers that are quoted to the kilowatt hour. When I asked the consultant, well, what are the uncertainties on the numbers that you're presenting in these reports? He said, we're not concerned with the accuracy of the numbers. We just take numbers from one report, put them into our report, and then off we go. That undermines the whole exercise for me. If you don't know how accurate the numbers are that you're using for your analysis, how can you even predict, you know, the uncertainties looking into 2026? They're predicting to the kilowatt hour how much electricity we're going to be using, but they don't even know if the numbers in 2017 are correct. And I think that's an important decision, which is an issue that the mayor has raised, is how accurate is the information that we're using. If the consultant says we're not going to look at that, again, it undermines the whole exercise to my way of thinking. And my last point is on policy. I think you've discussed the franchise fees at length. And you get the point that I'm also skeptical of that. And but the franchise fees provides the opposite incentives. The city gets more money if we use more water, because it's a percent. So, and here I'm going to say something maybe for once in my life that's going to please Dennis. And I would say we should flip the incentives the other way around and say, for every 10% that the city can decrease its water use, let's give these guys a 10% raise. And that would sort of motivate people in the right direction. And I'm not being facetious. They do it in utilities. It's called demand-side management. You pay the utility, you reward them for using less rather than using more. So I think these franchise fees are kind of a disaster. And my final comment is, I'm sort of an outsider, sort of looking at it as maybe a bit as a scientist, but we have a giant power plant in the El Dorado Valley, which produces almost as much electricity as Hoover Dam. It's 3 billion kilowatt hours a year. And that's 20 times as much electricity as we use in Boulder City. And it retails for almost $1 billion a year in California. So to me, looking at those numbers, it's kind of astonishing that we're sort of splitting hairs about, well, where can we find $10,000? We got this, it's as if we had a sort of water source, as an analogy, that was producing, 200,000 acre feet a year in the El Dorado Valley. And so, well, we can't look at that. That all goes to California, and now we have to split hairs about, the $2 that SNWA is charging us. I think we should look to make use of this gigantic power plant, which is soon enough going to produce more electricity than Hoover Dam, and find some way to use that to balance our rates. I think it's difficult, in the light of having such a gigantic power plant in the El Dorado Valley, to go to the residential guys and say, sorry, cost of whatever, and, your rates are just going to have to go up indefinitely. It's just not credible. So anyway, those are my 3 points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I may respond to those questions and comments.
Sure.
Yes. First of all, I'm sorry that he believes that that our report has no credibility. I think other members of the committee have stated otherwise. But the precision of our analysis, we rely on data, and we project that data. He's looking at some tables that were done in a tech memo that was a preliminary tech memo that we said, and I told him specifically that we will be revising how we present some of that so it doesn't give the perception that we're more precise than we are. So even the slide deck today, we weren't rounding things to the nearest dollar. So that's immaterial in the results of this, and I'm very sorry that he cannot rely on our work. But that said, we've spent a lot of time with the advisory committee providing information and understanding. We will have a significant computer model that staff will be able to use going forward in updating things and dealing with the figures and forecasts that will change from time to time. And so that, hopefully, you'll be able to utilize that, and Dennis and his staff will continue to be able to do that without the need for hiring a consultant to do that. That's one of the outcomes of our contract, was to provide that computer model, which is a very sophisticated, large computer file that will be used by staff. I think the issue with regard to again, the forecasts of customers and usage, the sources of data. I don't know the report that he's referring to with regard to energy consumption. What we looked at was how much energy did we buy that was provided by city data, and how much did we sell. So the one thing we know for sure, we can see we have copies of every bill every customer got. We have computer files with every bill, and we add those up. Now, if some customers were not billed, then that data is not in there. So all we can go with is the data we have. We didn't go out and try to audit individually, independently audit any financial information. That wasn't part of our contract. With regard to the franchise fee, the question that was asked is, how will the city use the franchise fee money? So, well, you have to talk to the finance director how the finance director would intend to use that money, but it'd be a financial resource to the general fund. The source, the franchise fee itself, we were asked to include a 5% franchise fee in that forecast. So we're not recommending that we include a franchise fee. So we still need, as with every study we do, we've done now over the last 10 years, probably 2,500 to 3,000 water, wastewater, and electric rate studies around the country. There are certain policy decisions that provide direction and information to the consultant that can change what we do. So if you don't want to provide those policy decisions, we will make a recommendation, go to cost of service, because we are asked to do a cost of service study. And then we'll provide that recommendation to you if that's what you like. But it was our understanding that we wanted to provide the council options to consider, which include to how we deal with city accounts and the phasing of cost of service and what period of time that we go to. So that policy decision can be very informative to us. It can actually improve the basis for the report so that it aligns with the city's policies. We're not asking you to recommend to us and us parroting back to you what you recommended to us. We're asking you what are the policies you would like us to incorporate. In fact, we started a process with the advisory committee with pricing objective policies and say, hey, let's go through all these pricing objectives, and then how can you help inform us what are the most important objectives to the city? And so there was some information that was provided, not consistent information, but that's where we started at the beginning of the process, back September of a year ago.
And again, I appreciate that. I think that, where we're at as far as the city goes, and I know you're aware, we never had a utility advisory committee before. I can tell you my experience from asking for information about our utilities. The information's not been forthcoming. The budgets weren't there. The capital improvement project lists were non-existent. So I certainly appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's been very helpful for you to be working with our utility advisory committee. But again, this is a giant leap ahead of wherever this city has ever been on looking at our rate structure. So bear with us on this, please.
Sure, and I appreciate that, and I'm very understanding. And work with advisory committees with utilities around the country, and every committee is established differently and given different parameters by the parties that in the governing body that establishes those advisory committees. But everyone's unique, and sometimes it's a learning process for utility staff, the advisory committee, as well as the consultant, to make sure we're all on on the same, in the same playing field. So we're all on the same page going, we're kind of going in the same direction, but I don't want to put too many blames on COVID, but certainly that disrupted a lot of regular meetings of the advisory committee that would have been beneficial during this period since last March. That we're trying to catch up now, but we're at the end of the process, so it's kind of how do we balance that?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Mr. Carl, you had a question or comment?
So first off, I apologize if it appeared that I was adversarial with the consultant, and I did not mean to be. And I think my voice structure even had a little bit of a change to it, and I apologize for that. A lot of this is I think if we just look at if you don't mind me going down quickly on some of these recommendations, and maybe you can understand where I'm trying to go. And I think hopefully that I'll speak for myself, and then hopefully the committee can help me out, or in the future we can work with it and make sure that we're looking at it. But I think the 3% and the $10 is something that hopefully, with all this data, it does look like that's a feasible aspect. And so if that's something we might want to go to at a faster pace. And so if I would understand correctly, we would want to do a recommendation to the council from the committee to figure out how to look at that, make sure everybody's on board, or the majority, however we vote. So it will need to be on a future agenda somewhere. Some of these other ones will take longer to do, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, just exactly what you said, is that we're trying to get more data. So it's not that, so we greatly appreciate the work you've done. We greatly appreciate the reports, and it is, as was stated in another meeting, that this is a really good report. It's the way it's been laid out and stuff. We just need to make sure that we can agree and understand the data behind it. That's the biggest thing we need. I think we're all saying a lot of that is that just we want to have a chance to understand the data more. So by looking at the overall, again, number one, the 3% and the $10 doesn't have to be, the data doesn't have to be gone into as much. It's not as problematic. When you look at the central fee and the franchise fee and the cost of service, that has a lot of data associated with it that really needs to be understood. So that's something that we want to go further on. The other thing is what are the next steps with the consultant? So are we going to have another meeting or two with the consultant? Is there going to be a draft final report so then we can have input before there's a final report? So those are things that I think we want to do and need to make sure what the advisory committee needs to do to help you guys as fast as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else have questions or comments? Councilmember Bridges?
I just have a question. Does the franchise fee become part of the cost of service?
Not until we get to a point where we need to really raise revenue. So right now, it's essentially coming out of fund balance.
Right. Yes.
For the immediate future. So to the extent, there's kind of a couple moving parts. One, the total revenue requirement that is net of what we take out of fund balance. So if it's not directly part of cost of service.
Okay, it's the sort of above the line revenues, above the line expense.
It'll come out of our fund balance.
Okay.
Until such time we need to raise revenues, then it would directly be included in that level of revenue. So it's we have fund balances that are coming down, we have expenditures that are going up at some point, and if we add in the franchise fee, we'll get to that crossing point sooner, and then it'll have to be reflected in the overall revenue requirement for rate determination.
Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Councilmember Adams?
Thank you very much. I guess to follow up with committee member Carr's kind of question statement is, and maybe this question is best directed for Dennis, what is our timeline look moving forward? Obviously, there's a lot to digest here. The committee certainly wants some more time to look at what are we looking at moving forward as far as, when is this coming back in front of the committee? When are we looking at making some of these decisions? How much time do we have to really digest all of this information?
And item number 2 is actually that discussion.
Of course.
If you want
forgot.
to hold off to that, we can have that quick discussion. So.
I almost forgot that was on there.
Mr. Carr?
The only thing is, I guess the thing is that's time scales for the report, but really, we also want to do the next steps for the rate study. So it would really be understand what's the next steps for the rate study would be helpful.
And I can answer that. They have to happen soon. And the reason I say that is we're coming to the end of the consultant's contract. So the quicker we can get there, the better. And we had even had a discussion with regards to future meetings as maybe expediting a couple of meetings so that we can get an eventual recommendation to City Council very soon.
Yeah, I would think that, a draft report, that's a lot of what's here is a draft. But something like that, we probably need to see that fairly soon.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Any other questions or comments on this portion of it? Mr. Carr?
One more. Yep. One more I forgot to include is I think the importance of the financial plan, though, is if I understand correctly, the City Council will be asked to do a tentative vote in November for the utilities budgets and the CIP, the capital improvement funds. So that's something that the committee has been striving to try to get to, but we're still looking for more data. And I guess that was part of the reason to understand especially the financial data for 22 is how we can help make a recommendation to you. So it depends on if we have to do that in November, or we can say, yeah, the final is in June, but we definitely have to have something like April, like we planned last year before COVID hit, and then we didn't. But so that's one thing we need to understand too, is to get that. But that does somewhat tie into the study somewhat, or we definitely need to work with the financial group better to get a little better understanding of these numbers.
And, the capital improvement project list, yes, that's normally kind of the first step in our budget process, is to look at that, and then we kind of know where we can go from there, and it's usually done in November. I think it has to be done, or at least the timeline has been set to have it done by December. But we're still looking at a lot of uncertainty about capital projects. Through the end of the year, we have a process in hold where projects are on hold and have to be reviewed individually. So I don't know how long that's going to last. We may need to extend that, or we may let it expire in December. But even if we're not going to go ahead with the projects, I agree, it's vital that we identify what the projects are.
But I guess that is the next agenda step too, is what you guys want from us. So that's I'll get to that.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else? All right, then we'll move to number 2, which are the timescales for the reports to update the council. Again, this discussion has obviously been very helpful to me anyway. I think there's a lot of information here. I know part of the problem has been that the Utility Advisory Committee has not been able to meet. Mr. Porter, do you have a tentative schedule for the remainder of the year for the committee?
I think with regards to the completion of the rate study, like I said, we really need to get that. The portion where the consultant's involved, we need to get that complete. Whether that has to be tied directly to a report to council from the UAC, that would be helpful, but I guess it doesn't have to be. I'm going to look to the consultant a little bit for completion of the cost of service portion. And if we can get that completed relatively quickly, we could have our next utility advisory committee relatively soon, in the next 2 to 3 weeks, or even go back to our regularly scheduled.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's time we get back to the regularly scheduled. That lets everybody plan a little better for, and again, we don't know what's going to happen, but.
Right. But as far as the completion of their work, we're almost done with their contract from a financial perspective. So that's kind of what's driving the need to get a recommendation out of the committee and an eventual decision from City Council.
Okay.
So I think we can, certainly our plan would be get a draft report within 4 to 6 weeks. And then that can be reviewed by Dennis, his staff, and the advisory committee. And then once we get those, then just turn around a final report. So that report essentially would cover much of what we've done here. So it'll either be, if we haven't gotten any direction, we'll include similar kind of information. But more detail on the cost of service, and then the final rate design elements. And then we'd have incorporate how rates could change over the next, during the upcoming period, so.
Yeah, and I think the draft report could be distributed to the council members at the same time, whenever it's ready. We can certainly get a head start on taking a look at it, so.
And the other thing to keep in mind is, as much as we're tied, closely, obviously, with the consultant, is we somewhat have also bought some time, because we're not recommending any of these go into effect until the next budget cycle. So there's a little wiggle room there, but still, the quicker the better.
Any other questions or comments? Stop pointing at each other.
I guess I'm talking too much, but wasn't a 3% decrease this year? So to the next budget cycle, we're supposed to be maybe increasing? How does that work then?
It was shown as starting in the next fiscal year. Or I'm sorry, in this fiscal year.
So 2021 is when it originally been projected?
Is that right? Yeah.
That's now, we're in there.
But that would be tied to, then it's tied back to that schedule of getting it done as quick as we could.
Right. Well, and again, with the way that our utility is, that's a decision that council can make. I don't think we're ready to make that yet, but I don't think we have to wait till next June to make the decision.
Oh, no, and I wasn't saying that. I certainly wasn't suggesting that.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Well, and I'm short. Initially, my comment was going to be, I understood the consultant to suggest that we could reduce the rates now, not having to wait until the next fiscal year. So that has evidently been cleared up. But I would also like to suggest that the Utility Advisory Committee meet again in October. We had wanted to have a couple of meetings a month until we could catch up and not wait until the 1st of November to meet again, but we do need to start meeting regularly.
Yes, and holiday season's coming, and that those holidays need to get looked at. But not having a set schedule tends to see things slip. So I agree. It's having a set day, just like all the other committees have. Whether it's the third Thursday or second Tuesday or whatever it is. Have a set schedule and try and adhere to that as best as possible.
And that's our plan, is to get back into our set schedule, which was pre-COVID. It was the first Wednesday of every month. We did talk about trying to get another meeting somewhat sooner. There are some challenges with the schedule, with the elections, some of the other things that are going on with early voting and some of that with this room and the other committees meeting. We have changed the time where we've been starting, so I'll talk to the chair and we'll get some meetings set up as quick as we possibly can.
All right.
And get on the regular schedule.
And, as far as the reports go, I had mentioned that at the outset that the desire had been to have a report come to the council prior to the budget being done so that we could have that information available to do the budget. With the pandemic, that simply wasn't possible. So I guess we need to kind of look at when we would want it. I think that the report from the consultants, in some ways, not in all ways, but that draft could be presented to council with comments from any committee member wishing to do so, and we can look at that all at one time. I don't know how the committee members feel about that, but I do understand, the reason I'm suggesting that is I understand the difficulty that there is because of your meeting schedule and the open meeting law and all that, to be able to come up with a report. But if each of you wants to do your comments separately, I don't believe there's any issue with us looking at those together. Mr. Carl?
Just as you said, make sure that the rest of the committee agrees. So we're looking at the draft to be done by 4 to 6 weeks. So that would be, hopefully, we can get a meeting either at the end of October or the first Wednesday on November. Now I'm hearing that with the election, I'm wondering if that means our November timeframe is. So I guess we need to find out within 4 to 6 weeks how many meetings we can have. We're going to have one, we're going to have two, or we're going to have none. And if we only have one, there might be something we could get back to, but most likely not, because we'd need discussion time and something else. But the other thing too is, did I miss the turnaround time that the consultant wanted on the draft?
I believe it was said to be 4 to 6 weeks.
No, I mean from the committee.
Once we hit your comments, then we can turn the final around hopefully within 2 weeks.
So you want the committee's comments in 2 weeks?
No.
Okay.
Whenever you get your comments,
what feasible?
We'll be on hold until we get your comments.
What feasible time frame would be for that?
How much ever time you guys need. So I don't know because you're volunteers, so that's something we need to discuss.
So I guess basically, we should put some type of time frame on it being a month or something like that, and try to do it something similar, and then maybe we can discuss that at another committee meeting. But I guess what I'm looking at is that's 2 months from now to get a report to you, and that might be the best we can do with all this information going on, unless we just said, like I said before, we do a simple recommendation and say, and I think if I'm understanding Dennis, we look at, like a lot of people are saying, number one, the 3% and the $10 is something that could happen relatively soon. So maybe that's a recommendation we could try to put into a report form after 2 meetings, possibly.
I think it can actually accompany your comments with the draft report.
Okay, just so you know, it's most likely going to be 2 months or better before that probably happens.
Well, again, that's the problem is, how many meetings it takes to finalize a report, and that's why I'm suggesting that rather than a formal report from the committee, that each committee member submit their comments. And the city council members need to make the final decision anyway. So, we can look at the comments and evaluate those as far as what decision each council member finally comes to.
Okay, thank you.
And just one more point, as I work with Larry on scheduling those meetings, we'll also take into account, because I know finance is working on the schedule for both the tentative CIP as well as the operating budgets, and we could try to the extent that we can, we'll try to coordinate those.
Thank you. Councilmember Hoskins?
Well, I was just noticing, I think maybe the city clerk and the city attorney might want to say something.
Just my concern, and the city attorney can weigh in on this, is when you receive comments from individual members, that's just not how a public body makes recommendations. You speak with one voice, and they would have to discuss it among themselves and make a recommendation as a body.
Yeah, and I appreciate the comment. I just don't think the structure of this committee is that way. That's not how it was set up. You know, we've had comments from the individuals today. Mr. City Attorney, is there some law that you're aware of that requires them to issue only one report, whether it's in a draft format or not, that's the only way they can communicate with the council?
Well, as a committee, right, if you're seeking the recommendation of the committee as a whole, it is a public body, and they speak with one voice, and that is in a public meeting.
Well,
but to your point, though, Mayor, you know, they are made up of individuals, and individuals do have rights to make comment and give their feelings as individuals, but not speaking representative of the public body.
So I think we just need to come to the understanding that it would be individual comments versus a single report. And as long as we identify it that way, then there should not be an issue?
They always have their right to opine individually, but if the council is asking for a recommendation from the body as a whole, that does happen at a public meeting after deliberation and some action. So, yeah, if you distinguish it as such, and that those recommendations are made available at the time the public body.
Well, whatever the committee is able to do that has time within their meeting schedule to do, if they're not able to produce this report that they can stamp on it that it's their one single formal report, and they just say, we didn't have time to do that, so we're offering you our individual statements. Any issue with that you're aware of? And again, I'm not sure what you're referring to as far as what's required by these bodies.
When the body is making a recommendation, it is a advisory body to the council, right? And that has to be with one voice, those recommendations. If we're just saying, well, we're not going to have time, so each make it individually, it could be seen or even argued that we are trying to do an end around to the normal process. That would be my concern, is that an argument could be made.
Well, I'd appreciate then if you'd research that further,
sure.
that if they're unable to state in a memo, whether it's individuals or a formal report from the body as a whole. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can read the minutes too, right? We can read comments that individuals make, and that's not, doesn't have to be, and they don't have to speak with one voice.
No, each of them, and this gets back to the prior discussion, each of them as citizens has the ability to opine on any matter of public concern. They have that ability, but they also happen to be members, volunteer members of a public body, and have obligations and duties that pertain to that public body. And so, if we decide, hey, we're gonna do away with the normal process of this public body because they can't meet in time to get us back, their one voice or their recommendation, that doesn't look very good. It doesn't. Yeah,
It's like you're circumventing the process, and if you wanted 7 individual opinions,
no, I think it can be
committee.
clearly stated what the process is. But again, if you could prepare something formal for us we can certainly consider that. And then if they're unable to do it, we'll just tell them, you know what, whenever you can get your report to us. We can certainly take it either direction. So again, this agenda that we have right now is not set to make any decisions. So
That's
we're not
correct.
making decisions.
That's correct.
We're
And I'm
discussing
happy-
possibilities right now.
Absolutely. I'm happy to provide further information on that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Todd?
This has been a heck of an experience and a lot of fun, but this is my opinion in the workshop that we're having today. We need to have another workshop for the committee within 2 weeks, so we can then formally vote or present our recommendation by November, the first formal meeting we have in November. We've also got some homework or some housekeeping issues with our committee. We've got a new member. He's never been formally recognized in a meeting. So we need to do that. We also need to take, and because a person made a comment last time, we need to have a vote as to chairman and co-chair. So this is all stuff that's on record as public meeting. So I recommend within 2 weeks we have a workshop with the committee to give a unified voice as to our recommendations for the draft report. Once that's done, then a final report can come out and be presented in a formal meeting.
Thank you.
And I'll look to our city attorney here, but if we're in a workshop format, we're probably not going to be able to do some of that. Because if we're actually going to take action, that doesn't mean we can't just schedule a regular meeting and agendize it, and then we can fulfill that.
Dr. Reed?
So I don't want to be a smart aleck, but I kind of saw this coming a year ago. When we formed this committee, I immediately said we need to have timelines and deadlines so that we can plan ahead, because it's so cumbersome with the open meeting law and so on. And it took me like 4 months to actually get a discussion of deadlines onto the agenda. When you go at that pace, I had, for example, a question from Councilwoman Folder in May about an issue with WAPA and a thing, and I'm still trying to get it on the agenda 6 months later. So we need to change the way we run these meetings. I think it is possible to be efficient and get things done in a timely manner. We do it at UNLV. We're a bunch of egghead idiot scientists who don't know how to operate, but we get our stuff done on time. We had our meetings on time. We didn't say, well, it's COVID, we give up. We got our job done. So I think let's not give up. It's been a bit of a mess this year, but I think we can sort out this committee to run it much more efficiently and get things done on time. I think it is possible. And we just have to set our deadlines a long time ahead and say, this is when this needs to be done. We'll work with whatever we have at this point, and then we'll deliver these reports. It says so in the resolution. We're supposed to report on the CIP once a year. We didn't do it. I apologize for that. I think it's our responsibility. We can't blame the city for everything. We should have done it, and we didn't do it, and I hope we can change that in the coming weeks and get the job done. I think everybody who's on the committee should be on there. They're all very knowledgeable, but we can work more efficiently, and I intend to do my best to deliver these products to you guys in a timely manner in the future.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkinson?
There's discussion about a workshop and then a formal meeting. Can we have a workshop, adjourn, and then reconvene in a formal meeting on the same day?
If it's agendized as such.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, third item is discussion of future agenda items and regular meeting times. I think we've fairly well covered that, but if there's anything else anyone would like to offer?
I'll just throw out, I'll be working with Larry on that. We made a list of some of the future agenda items at our previous workshop. So we can just work on that together and get that out to the committee.
Okay.
And we'll take into consideration the concept of a workshop going to a regular meeting. I think that's not a bad idea.
Okay, and again, I think it always needs to be kept in mind too that when committee members request agenda items based on the timelines, I mean, they can't ask for it the day before, but they need to be included, and that way things that they want to talk about don't get left off agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Well, if it is going to be 4 weeks or so, 4 to 6 weeks before you get the report, it looks like that if we could get this, then that means November 9th. So then if we can get the review done by the 30th, then we could have it back as a final draft, as final at the 14th. Is that correct? That makes sense? And then we can meet on the 16th to make a recommendation. Would that be possible for us? That's what my thoughts on a timeline. So I think we should meet at least by the 21st of this month if we're going to do this.
I would keep in mind that as far as, and thank you for stating it that way, for the council, and I do understand the consulting contract is coming to an end, but our next deadline is going to be the capital improvement project list. We generally shoot to have that done prior to the end of the year so the rest of the budgeting process can go forward. So, sorry about the report. I'm not sure if that makes it slip or just say that those are two priorities, the CIP list and the report, the draft report anyway, as far as getting comments or a final report to the council on that. Any other questions or comments? All right, we'll go to our final public comment period then. Public comment during this period can be on any item, any subject. Anyone wishing to call in, the phone number is 702-589-9629. Again, this is our final public comment period. The phone number is 702-589-9629.
Public comment.
Yes, I have public comment.
Go ahead.
Yes, so good afternoon again. For the record, Fred Volz. I have reactions to three subjects that were discussed today. In the review of cost of service results for both electric and water, the imbalance for cost of services would be substantially reduced if there was no franchise fee and if the central services fee was considerably reduced to actual services used, not a seat-of-the-pants guesstimate based on other jurisdictions' policies. Whether the money comes out of excess balances collected from ratepayers in the past or future rates paid, the ratepayers are still paying this expense, and it is taking money away from other uses in the utility function. These two changes would effectively wipe out a large portion of the claimed revenue imbalance. Remember, the argument that all the other kids do it doesn't mean it is appropriate to follow the unsound group thinking. Water cost of service needs to be handled in two different ways. For the water used to irrigate parks and other general city facilities that are of general benefit to the populace, the wholesale rate should be preserved, since increased rates will only amount to another tax on city residents. The two golf courses are collectively the largest users of city-consumed potable and raw water, and they need to be treated as enterprise funds, just as the city airport is, just as the utility funds are. Any increase in rates to the full retail price would and should be paid for by users of the golf courses, not every utility ratepayer in the city through residential subsidies. The privately owned Cascada golf course has been a significant revenue generator for the city water utility since it pays retail water rates, not wholesale. Finally, water conservation factored into rate making and usage levels is the responsibility of government, not just private users. For weeks, fire hydrants at the south entrance to Veterans Memorial Park and in front of the Mormon Church on Clubhouse Drive have been leaking without detection or repair by the appropriate city department. Both problems were reported to city officials, but there's been no action. In the last week, Frank Crow Park and the municipal golf course had their sprinklers running midday when evaporation is greatest. Thank you, and I would ask that these comments be added to the record verbatim.
Thank you. The phone line is available. Anyone wishing to call in for public comment? The phone number is 702-589-9629. This is the final public comment period for the combined City Council Utility Advisory Committee workshop. Anyone wishing to speak in the final public comment period may call 702-589-9629. All right, hearing no others, we'll close the public comment period. Again, Madam City Clerk, no written comments submitted. All right. Again, thank you all. Appreciate everybody's input on this. It's been a tough year getting things scheduled and all that, but we're getting closer. So again, thank you, and we're adjourned.